Chapter 1. Bobbi Radcliffe looked up from her computer as a dewy-eyed couple approached her. "We want to go rock climbing," the man told her. "We're on our honeymoon." "I can definitely help you with that, Mr. and Mrs. Stanton. Are you staying with us here at Valley View Hotel?" "We are," Mr. Stanton told her. "We met rock climbing in a gym, and we thought it would be the best way to spend our honeymoon. We were told there are some good places to go in Logan Canyon. Do you know where I mean?" Bobbi nodded, smiling at the couple. "Are you experienced enough that you simply need a map, or do you need me to find a guide to take you?" Mr. Stanton glanced at his wife. "Do you have a preference?" "This is my first time climbing outside a gym, so I would feel better if we had a guide." Mrs. Stanton looked as if she was excited to go, but also a little fearful. "I have a guide I can call immediately." "Do you have a preference of which day you go?" Bobbi had been through this scenario with different guests of the hotel a dozen times in the past month. "Tomorrow, if possible," Mr. Stanton said. "We have to go home on Saturday." Bobbi nodded. It was Thursday, so they really only had one day to get their climbing in. She didn't ask why they'd waited until so late in their stay. They were newlyweds, so she had some pretty good ideas of what they were doing. "I'll call Sam immediately. He handles all the climbers." She picked up the phone and made the arrangements, giving the couple a card. "I assume you saw the prices for guided climbs in our guide?" Mr. Stanton nodded. "A little steep, but worth it." She pointed out the information they would need on the card. "You'll meet Sam in the south parking lot at 8 tomorrow morning. It'll be a 45-minute drive into the canyon, where he'll provide all the equipment you'll need. The hotel will provide a lunch for the three of you. Sam usually eats in the truck but lets his climbers eat beside the Bear River." She smiled sweetly. "I hope you find your climb enjoyable." "We will." The couple wandered away holding hands. As Bobbi watched them go, she thought about how much she wished she knew how to find someone. She was always busy, though, and never seemed to have any time for romance or even a first date. Another young couple approached, and Bobbi wondered why the honeymooners were coming out of the woodwork. Instead of asking, she plastered on a smile. "How can I help you today?" "We want somewhere nice to eat. Can you recommend a good restaurant?" "And no chains," the woman said. "We prefer not to eat somewhere we can eat at home." "Where are you from?" Bobbi asked. Knowing what part of the country they came from helped her decide where to send people. You did not send someone from Texas to a Mexican food place, because Texans hated Utah Mexican food. "We're on our honeymoon," was the answer from the young woman. "From New Jersey." "Lots of honeymooners here this week," Bobbi said with a smile. "Do you have a favorite cuisine?" "I wonder if Dr. Lachele is upping the number of honeymooners in this country," the woman said. "I don't think we care. Something local." "I would recommend the Black Bear Diner then." Bobbi pushed a brochure across the counter with the menu of the Black Bear and directions. "May I ask who Dr. Lachele is?" The woman laughed softly. "She's this woman who introduces people at the altar. She seems a little batty, with her purple curls and all, but then she finds you the perfect person." "Right, Andy?" Andy nodded. "I think she's a witch or something. More like a fairy godmother." They both laughed. "Her business is called Matrimony, and it's based in New York, but she'll match you with someone across the country or someone right there in your town. It takes a whole day of psychological testing, which can be brutal, but she made the whole process fun. I met Andy at the altar 3 months ago, but we had to delay our honeymoon." "Matrimony?" The wheels in Bobbi's head were turning quickly. She loved the idea of just walking down the aisle to a man who was right for her. What could be better? The woman nodded. "Trust me. Call Dr. Lachele." Bobbi watched as the couple left the hotel and saw it was time for her break. Good. She had a phone call to make. 2 months later, Bobbi waited in the back of a small church in Logan, Utah. Her parents were looking at her like she'd lost her mind, but her best friend, Gloria, was right there with her. Gloria and her husband Jerry had built the Valley View Inn and had run it for over 20 years. Bobbi had worked for them for the past 5 years, and they had become like family to her. "Are you sure you want to go through with this?" Mom asked. "What if the man is, well, what if he's odd?" Bobbi laughed. "Is there a person alive today who isn't odd? I'll take an odd man over a boring one any day." Her father frowned. "What if he's abusive? Then I still have my parents who will let me move back home in an instant." Bobbi was the youngest of 5 kids, and she'd always lived at home, going to Utah State University, there in Logan. Her parents had never stopped treating her as the baby of the family. "Well, of course you could come home." Mom sighed. "I guess you can do what you need to do. It just worries me." The door opened and a woman with purple hair rushed in, grabbing Bobbi in a hug. "I needed that booby bump. Are these your parents?" Bobbi nodded, smiling at the look of shock on her father's face. "They are. Dr. Lachele, these are my parents, George and Georgette Radcliffe." Then in a stage whisper, she added, "Don't make fun of their names. They don't like that." Bobbi's mother glared at her. "Call me Georgie." "I love that name," Dr. Lachele said, spreading her arms wide and pulling Georgie in for one of her famous booby bumps. "It's so good to meet you both." George folded his arms over his chest as if he was afraid he'd be treated to a booby bump as well. "We're worried about our daughter." Whose ridiculous idea was it for her to marry a man she'd never met? "Well, the initial idea of a business introducing people at the altar was mine, but she's the one who contacted me and asked me to find love for her. I believe I've done just that." Dr. Lachele shrugged. She was obviously used to people not liking her business model. It wouldn't make sense for a lot of people, but it was just right for Bobbi. Mom shook her head. "I worry that he'll be abusive or something." Dr. Lachele smiled. "I understand your worry completely. I would feel the same if my daughter was marrying a man she'd never met. Does it help to realize that I've done a deep background check on both people before I ever think to introduce them? And I do an 8-hour psychological exam. I think I am careful enough that people don't slip through the cracks. In the 122 marriages I've brokered since 2015, not a single couple has divorced and not a mass murderer in the bunch." "Well, that's good to know." George looked at Dr. Lachele as if she'd lost her mind. "Why would you think introducing people at the altar was a good idea anyway?" Dr. Lachele shrugged. "I've always been able to meet someone and know who they belonged with. Couples would meet, and there would be some little thing about the other person they found irritating and they'd call it off fast, both of them a little afraid of falling in love. They weren't giving love a chance. Now that I've started my business, and I require people to sign a contract stating they will live together for a full year, I find that it always works out. I'm sure it's going to be great. I have no time for dating, and I get to skip that awkward phase of meeting someone," Bobbi said quickly, trying to keep her parents from grilling Dr. Lachele. Dr. Lachele laughed, a light tinkle that made Bobbi smile. "You don't think it's going to be awkward being married to a stranger?" "Oh, child. I thought you understood what you were doing better than that." Bobbi blushed and shrugged. "I do. I just know if I'm too awkward, he can't run away, at least not for a while." Her parents looked concerned as Dr. Lachele laughed at her words, and Bobbi decided it would all be fine. What could go wrong when you marry an absolute stranger? Gary Grant stood at the front of the church, waiting for everything to start. He wasn't certain he was doing the right thing, but he wanted sons. And he wasn't going to get them if he didn't get married, so it had to be the right thing, didn't it? His friend and best man Liam leaned forward. "Stop being nervous. It's all going to be fine." Liam had been Gary's best friend since he'd moved to Logan 2 years before to open his restaurant. La Cocina was everything he'd been working for his entire life. He'd spent 5 long years in the Texas heat learning to cook Tex-Mex, and he felt that he had the best Mexican restaurant in all of Logan, if not all of Utah. Liam was his neighbor, a firefighter, and they often spent their days off together. Not that Gary took a lot of days off. He was too busy making certain his restaurant always operated at peak condition. In fact, he was more nervous about leaving his restaurant for 2 weeks than he was about marrying a stranger. "You're still going to check in on the restaurant every day?" Gary asked his friend. Liam shook his head. "You act like that restaurant is a small child being left alone for the first time ever. I'll be there for lunch every day, and I'll pop in for supper at least once." "Does that make you feel better?" "It does. And that restaurant is my baby." And then music started playing. It was a soft tune that Gary didn't recognize, but he had to give his bride props for not going with the wedding march. That thing was way overdone. A woman who had to be a good 20 years older than he was carried a bouquet of flowers down the aisle and took her place across from him and Liam. Gary hoped that her age wasn't indicative of his future wife's. She had to be too old for kids. What had he gotten himself into? And then a young woman, close to his own age, began walking toward him in a white dress, clutching a bouquet of flowers. He couldn't see her features well from so far away, but as she grew closer, he studied her. Yes, she was much better than the first woman. When the man walking her down the aisle stopped at the front of the church and put her hand in his, Gary clutched hers as if it were a lifeline. He had no time to form an opinion of her, because the preacher started talking. "Dearly beloved." Gary's mind wasn't on the wedding service. Instead, he kept looking over at the pretty girl beside him, trying to figure out why she'd marry a stranger. It was hard enough for a man to marry a woman he'd never met, but for a woman to marry a man she'd never even seen? That had to be so much harder. She was a tiny little thing, and she could easily be overpowered by him. He wouldn't do anything to her, of course, but she had no way of knowing that. He had to be prompted to say his vows, and he felt a little silly, but he had been so lost in thought looking at her. He couldn't wait to be alone with her so they could talk. When the preacher told Gary he could kiss the bride, he looked at her for a moment before lowering his head and brushing his lips gently across her cheek. He didn't want their first kiss to be in front of people. No, he was going to make his marriage work, and to him that meant a first kiss that was both private and special. She stared up at him, her eyes confused. He smiled, bringing her hand to his lips and kissing the back of it. He needed her to know he wasn't rejecting her. As soon as the ceremony was over, he pulled her toward the back of the church and opened the first door he found back there. "I didn't want to kiss you for the first time in front of a crowd of people. I wanted our first kiss to be special." Her eyes lit up, and she smiled. "That makes a lot of sense. Your name is Gary, right?" The ceremony had been quick, and she wasn't sure if she had even heard the preacher correctly. It was strange marrying a stranger. He nodded. "And I didn't catch yours at all." "It's Roberta. Everyone calls me Bobbi." "It's good to meet you, Bobbi." He led her to a few chairs. "Sit with me, and we'll talk a little." She nodded, before smoothing her dress under her to sit. "Tell me about yourself. What do you do, and why did you agree to marry in this insane way?" Gary chuckled softly. "Well, I'm a chef. I'm the owner of La Cocina here in town. I've sent people there, and they always rave about the food." Bobbi told him. "You've sent people to my restaurant, but you've never gone yourself?" he asked. That didn't make sense to him at all. "I'm a concierge. I rarely have time to go to dining establishments. Instead, I send people there and they tell me how wonderful they are or aren't." She shrugged. "I work at Valley View Hotel." His eyes widened. "I know that place. It's pretty fancy." She nodded. "And I tend to work a ridiculous number of hours, so I don't go to restaurants often, and I don't have time to meet people." "It's the same for me," he said, his face excited. "That's why I called Dr. Lachele. Well, we already have our first thing in common, other than where we live, of course. Dr. Lachele told me that I really need to take the next 2 weeks off work to go on a honeymoon." "You did the same?" He nodded. "I figured we'd drive down to Salt Lake in the morning, and we'll fly out tomorrow. I've always wanted to escape when it gets cold, and I thought we could go to South Padre Island in Texas." "Works for me. I never take time off work, so I'm excited to do something different." "I'm glad." He looked into her eyes that were as blue as the Caribbean Sea. How about that first kiss? She smiled and raised her lips, closing her eyes. When his lips brushed gently across hers, she leaned closer, wanting a deeper kiss. She'd spent her entire life so focused on getting what she wanted out of life that she had never even bothered to date. This was her very first kiss, and it was special to her. When he lifted his head, he smiled. Well, I think I could get used to that. He considered talking to her about sleeping arrangements, but decided that would be better left for later. He certainly wanted to start their marriage with a perfect wedding night, but he would let her take the lead in how she wanted to handle that. I think I could too. Do you want to go out and meet my parents and my best friend, Gloria? I'd like that a lot. He stood and reached his hand down for hers. Did you plan a reception or anything? She shook her head. I thought about it, but the preacher said we could hang out for an hour or two after the wedding. I just didn't plan food or anything. I didn't invite many people, mainly just my friend, Liam. Not even people from the restaurant? Are you kidding? I wasn't going to spare any of my employees to come to the wedding. They were already down a couple of men just by losing me for a while. I have got to try that place. I hate that I haven't. If I'd known I'd be marrying the man who ran the place, you can be certain I'd have made time. We'll go by for supper. That way I can make sure everything is running smoothly. She tilted her head to one side. Are you worried they can't do it without you? I know they can, or they wouldn't work for me, but I've learned that the more time I spend there, the fewer problems there are. I guess that makes sense. I'd love to try it. Gary smiled. That's what we'll do then. I was going to cook for you at home, but this will work for both of us. Where's home? She asked. I have a house here in Logan. 3 beds, 2 baths. It's not fancy, but it's home. I can't wait to see it. Bobbi followed him out of the room and took him straight to her parents. Mom, Dad, this is Gary. Gary, my parents, George and Georgette. For a minute, Gary thought she was joking about the names, but no one was laughing. It's nice to meet you both. Her dad shook his hand with a firm grip. You're not going to hurt my baby. No, sir, I'm not. Gary met the other man's eyes and waited for him to nod. All right. We'll make this work. My siblings are all out of town, and I didn't invite them because I wanted the wedding to be small. I'm sure you'll meet them for Thanksgiving. Bobbi knew all of them had their own lives. She was the only unmarried child her parents had, and she was married now. Hopefully, her siblings would just be thankful they hadn't gotten an invitation and felt like they had to come. Chapter 2. Happy to be leaving the church, Bobbi looked over at her new husband. We grabbed my suitcases, right? I know I'll need to move a lot of stuff when we get back, but that should be enough to keep me going for a couple of weeks until we get back from our honeymoon. Have you been to this place before? South Padre? Gary asked. I have a couple of times. I had a friend who liked to go there during school breaks, and I'd tag along. Lots of fun, sand, and ocean. And silly little t-shirt shops and tourist places. There's even miniature golf if you enjoy that sort of thing. Sounds good. And parasailing. I'm hoping I can talk you into parasailing. Bobbi swallowed hard. I'm not sure about that, sounds like it's too high in the air for me. He frowned. Hopefully, you can get over that. I went parasailing there a few years ago, and it was amazing. I seriously have never seen anything like it. I'm sure the views are amazing, but being that high up in the air, over the ocean, would be pretty scary for me. We'll talk about it more when we get there, he told her. She could tell he really wanted her to do the parasailing thing, but she wasn't sure she could do it. I'd cheer for you from the ground. I guess I'll have to settle for cheering then, won't I? He looked disappointed, but she didn't know how she could help that. She wouldn't be able to go up that high in the air. She was afraid of glass elevators. I'm going to take my e-reader. I just filled it up with 1,000,000 books, and I'm so excited. You want to read on our honeymoon? He asked. Sure. I mean, I'm sure we'll do stuff together, but I'll have time to read too, won't I? It's a beach, and I'm bringing along beach reads. He stopped in front of a house located close to the college. Here we are. I figured we'd both want to change before supper. He gave her an inquiring look. She nodded. Yeah, I picked this dress out when I first contacted Dr. Lachele, which was a couple of months ago. It's too cold to wear it outside much. And my employees would laugh at me if I showed up at the restaurant wearing this. He looked down at his tux and sighed. It had been important to him to make a good first impression. He walked to the back of the SUV and grabbed both of her suitcases, carrying them into the house. He desperately wanted to ask her if she'd share his room right away, but he was realizing more and more how different they were. It saddened him. Expecting a girl who liked to have fun in the same ways he did had obviously been a mistake. I'll show you to the guest room. I figure you'll be more comfortable there for this first night at least. Bobbi immediately felt rejected. She was attracted to the man beside her, and she couldn't understand why he didn't want to make love with her. It was their wedding night. All right. Didn't men go trolling for women to have one-night stands with? She was simply asking to start their relationship. He led her to the room he'd set up for guests and showed her the connected bath. Go ahead and change, and I'll call the restaurant and let them know we need a table. I'll be wearing jeans, he added, hoping it would help her to decide what to wear more quickly. Women tended to take forever to figure out what to wear in his experience. Bobbi nodded. She was glad she'd packed jeans and shorts. Dr. Lachele had told her to plan for a casual honeymoon in a warm climate. I'll be ready in 15. He nodded, mentally adjusting the time to 30 minutes. Women didn't know how to be on time. At least his sisters hadn't. As soon as he shut the door, Bobbi struggled to get out of her wedding dress, not quite able to reach the zipper in the back. Finally, she just pushed the sleeves down, which made it so she could reach the zipper because her arms were no longer constricted, and stepped out of it. Not the best solution, but it worked for her. It took mere minutes to get out of her dress and underthings, and then she hoisted her suitcase onto the bed and unzipped it, finding jeans and a button-down blouse that would go well with them. She completed the look by slipping into a pair of sneakers and then went out into the living room to wait for Gary. It was a few minutes before he walked into the living room, stopping short when he saw her waiting for him. How did you get ready so fast? She lifted an eyebrow. All I had to do was change clothes. That doesn't exactly take a long time. It would have taken my sisters at least an hour. I hope you're not judging me on your sisters. Gary shook his head. Of course not. Bobbi kept watching him, wishing he'd acknowledge her difference from his siblings. Are you ready then? She asked. He nodded. I called the restaurant, and they'll have a table ready for us in 5 minutes. He headed for the front door before she could say anything else to make him feel like a jerk. She was right though, he shouldn't be judging her based on what his sisters were like. Back at the SUV, he got in and waited for her to buckle her seatbelt. I sure hope you like Tex-Mex, because I have a feeling we'll be eating it a lot. Aren't you a chef? She asked. He nodded. And I cook all day long. It's nice to not have to cook at night. She smiled. I wouldn't want strangers to ask me where to eat dinner after I'm off work, so I see your point. The restaurant was a short 5-minute drive from the house. He parked in back, leaving the good parking spots for his guests. I don't let my employees park in the front, and just because I'm not working doesn't mean I don't need to set a good example. Makes sense. And it's not like you're making me walk a mile. It's only a few feet. She wished she'd thrown on a coat, but she hadn't taken the time. The temperature seemed to have dropped 15 degrees in an hour, but it was after dark, and as high as they were in the mountains there, it got chilly in the evenings even in the summer. He took her hand and wove his fingers through hers. Everyone here knows I was getting married today, but no one really knew the circumstances. I'd rather no one realized that I married a stranger. She nodded. I understand completely. He smiled at her. Thank you. When they stepped inside the restaurant, she was surprised that it was so busy. She'd heard amazing things about the place, but crowds hadn't been mentioned to her. The food must be worth the crowds. The hostess spotted him and grabbed 2 menus. She smiled at Bobbi. "You must be the new Mrs. Grant." "I am." She smiled and cast a glance at Gary, hoping she looked like she was in love. "I'm Andy. I've been here for over a year. Gary is a great boss." Gary laughed. "You don't have to butter me up, Andy. She already likes me a little bit." Andy laughed, leading them through the crowded restaurant to a table tucked away in a corner. "Does this work for you?" "Sure," Gary said. "Thanks." Before Bobbi even had a chance to glance at her menu, a young man was there. "I'm Aaron, and I'll be serving you today. Can I start you off with some drinks? Or an appetizer?" Gary nodded. "We want a combo of empanadas and a cup of queso." He looked at Bobbi. "What do you want to drink?" Bobbi looked at Aaron. "Do you have root beer?" "We have Barks." "Is that okay?" "My favorite." "And you?" Aaron asked Gary. "I'll have a Coke." "I'll be right back with your drinks, and I'll get your appetizer put in." Aaron hurried away, looking nervous. "I think you're freaking out your staff by being here as a guest." He shrugged. "They should be able to perform the way they always do with me here." "Should," she said, smiling. "What's good?" Looking over the menu, she was surprised at the sheer number of choices. "Everything, of course. There's nothing on the menu that I haven't worked out my own recipe and perfected." "That's helpful. What would you say your specialty is?" "Enchiladas. We offer some ground beef sour cream enchiladas that are to die for." She closed her menu. "Sounds delicious. I'll have that." When Aaron came back with their drinks, Gary ordered fajitas, and listened as she put in her order. "I want the beef sour cream enchiladas. No beans, just rice. And I want a side of guacamole." Gary carefully kept his face even. He hated special orders. Unless someone had a food allergy, they could eat what came with the meal he had so carefully perfected. "I'll get that in. Your appetizers should be out in a minute." Aaron hurried away. Bobbi took a sip of her root beer. "I'm looking forward to trying your queso. It bugs me that most of the Mexican restaurants in the area don't serve it. Why would you not serve cheese sauce with your chips? Makes no sense to me." Gary smiled. "I agree. And you'll notice I have plain queso and even queso with ground beef as part of my menu." "You are a smart businessman." Bobbi reached for a chip from the basket at the table and took a bite, crunching it louder than she'd meant to. "What's in your salsa?" "Tomatoes, onions, peppers, a little vinegar. All the usual." She took another chip and broke it in half, dipping the first half into the salsa. After popping the half into her mouth, she smiled. "That's good salsa. I'm a fan." "You seem like a food critic to me." "Not really a food critic," she said, "but I must suggest restaurants all day every day, so I try to make my own decisions about the food, so I can recommend it to people who ask. I can now tell people to try your salsa." "Do you sell it by the jar?" "I don't yet, but I've thought about bottling it for sale." "You should," she said. "This is the best salsa I've ever tasted." She dipped the other half of her chip and popped it into her mouth. "I can't wait to try the queso." Right on cue, Aaron came out of nowhere and set the queso and empanadas on the table. "Thank you," Bobbi said, looking at the empanadas. She was certain that was what he'd called them. "Tell me what an empanada is while I test your queso." "It's like a meat pie, but shaped in a half-moon usually, and filled with either sweet or savory. I chose beef, and these are really what would be called picadillo in Texas. So, it's ground beef with little, tiny chunks of potato, onion, and spices. One of my favorite things." She sighed. "Being married to you is going to thicken my waistline, I can tell already." She wasn't super careful about what she ate, but all the Mexican goodness he was putting in front of her was a little scary. Taking a bite of the queso, she sighed contentedly. "Queso is delicious. Of course. He smiled and moved one of the small empanadas onto her plate. Try that. While Gary watched her closely, she cut off a bite of the empanada with her fork and bit into it. That's delicious. It needs queso. That's why I ordered the two together. Bobbi smiled, dipping her knife into the queso and smearing some onto the empanada. I'm never going to cook for you. You may bring home food from here every night. He chuckled. Even I get sick of Mexican food eventually. I don't know how such a thing could be possible. She took a sip of her root beer. The food is excellent. It has a light spicy taste, but it's not overpowering. I don't need to take a drink after every bite. That's what I was going for. It wouldn't be Mexican food without a little spice, but I don't want people to hurt themselves eating my salsa. I have a friend who is allergic to every kind of pepper. Even black. They blister her tongue and throat. She could not eat here, but I think I'm in love with your restaurant. You have good taste, he said with a grin. A man in a suit appeared at the table and looked at Bobbi. I think I need an introduction, Gary. Gary reached over and squeezed her hand. Bobbi, this is my assistant manager, Jonathan. John, this is Bobbi, my wife. It's good to meet you, Bobbi. I hope we see you around here a lot. You don't need a job, do you? Jonathan asked with a grin. Gary's eyes narrowed. Did someone quit? Amanda gave notice. She's graduating next month, Gary sighed. We knew that was coming. Okay. You scared me for a minute there. You don't need to be thinking about work at all. Take your time off. I'll call you if something major goes wrong, but the plan is for everything to be smooth sailing. Or smooth parasailing, knowing you. Bobbi felt badly that she wasn't up for parasailing when it was obviously something he enjoyed. I'll keep his mind off work, she said, grinning at Gary. If she wasn't going to partake of his favorite activity, she could at least put on a show of being a loving wife. You two shouldn't be here pretending to be guests. You should be home, being newlyweds. Would you believe Bobbi has lived here her entire life, and she's never set foot in La Cocina? I had to bring her so the indoctrination could start. Bobbi smiled. I think it's already complete. I want to live in the kitchen, eating anything that doesn't turn out perfectly. After Jonathan left, Erin returned with their meals. She was disappointed that she'd barely had time to try the empanadas before her meal was there. We need to take what's left home for later, she said. She couldn't not eat this delicious food. Sure. We can get boxes. What time do we fly out tomorrow? She asked. Not until 3. I thought it would be easier if we could sleep a little late, and still get to the airport in Salt Lake in time for our flight. Sounds good. Bobbi didn't really care when they left. She was simply curious. We have a layover in Dallas and then we fly into Harlingen. We'll have to rent a car from there and it's about a 45-minute drive. I found an Airbnb on the beach. I love to walk on the beach late at night and see the waves rolling in. It sounds amazing. I can't wait. You sound like you've had Tex-Mex before. Have you been to Texas? She nodded. Yeah, I have an uncle in San Antonio, and we went to visit him once. My view of Mexican food will never be the same. I went to culinary school in Dallas, so I understand completely. Bobbi realized then that she hadn't noticed anyone around her through their meal. She'd been completely focused on her new husband. She'd rarely dated, but when she had, she'd been absorbed in what was going on around them, having a hard time paying attention to the boring man she was there with. To her, Gary was anything but boring. Maybe Dr. Lachele hadn't made a huge mistake, even though he didn't want to sleep with her. The man was strange. She should probably feel relieved that he wasn't rushing things, but for some reason, she wasn't. Not at all. When they got home, she carefully stored their takeout boxes in the fridge, determined to eat her leftovers for lunch before they left for the airport the next day. She turned and saw Gary leaning on the counter, watching her. What? She asked, feeling as if she'd done something wrong. He shook his head. Just looking at my beautiful wife. she smiled, walking to him and wrapping her arms around him. It felt so good to touch him. Soon, they'd be making love. Even if she had to seduce him. Chapter 3. After having their leftovers for breakfast, the following morning, Gary and Bobbi set out on the hour-and-a-half journey to the Salt Lake City airport. The sky looks a little scary, Bobbi told him from the passenger seat. It does. It's supposed to start snowing around 6 this evening, and they're expecting blizzard-like conditions. We should be in the air halfway to Dallas by then, though. There was a light snow by the time they reached Layton, and it was heavy by the time they reached the airport. I hope we can still fly out, Gary said as they parked in a lot where they could take a shuttle to the airport. It's getting bad. Bobbi shrugged. This is Salt Lake. I'm sure they fly in these conditions a lot. The shuttle driver only had the two of them as passengers. Have you checked to see how long your flight has been delayed for? He asked. Bobbi and Gary exchanged a look. Have all the flights been delayed then? The driver nodded. All the flights I've heard about. You should probably think about seeing if there's a hotel room open. Gary picked up his phone and searched for their flight number. Delayed by 5 hours. Bobbi sighed. That's not terrible. We'll walk around the airport and find stuff to do. I guess. The driver dropped them at their terminal, and they dropped off their luggage, walking to the counter, where they had to stand in a very long line. Other travelers were needing to figure out what to do as well. Can't we just check in on the little kiosk thingy? Gary shrugged. I was hoping that I could figure out plans by talking to an agent. All right then. The line took almost an hour. The airline employee smiled wearily. Your flight was delayed, and you want other options, right? That's right. We were supposed to be in South Texas by this evening. It's not going to happen. You could take a car out of the area and try to get to another airport, but Denver is covered up too. Maybe St. George, but you would have to drive through this mess to get there, and it's probably not safe. Nothing is going out? We're completely grounded at the moment. That snow is too heavy to take off or land, so everyone needs to wait until the snow stops. But they're predicting 2 days of heavy snow. They are. There's nothing we can do about that. Bobbi smiled at the airline employee. Thank you for letting us know. The weather is definitely out of your control. They went ahead and checked into their flight and walked away from the counter. Do you want to see if there's a hotel close by? He asked. She nodded, liking the idea of having some time with just him while they waited for their flight. That would be great. Gary spent the next hour making phone calls, but it seemed all the other grounded travelers had the same idea. Finally, he put his phone in his pocket. Nothing within 10 miles. In any direction. We're stuck here. Bobbi shrugged. The hospitality industry was all about emergencies, it seemed. Stranded in Salt Lake. Not my idea of a honeymoon, but we'll still make sure to have fun. Putting her hand in his, she pulled him toward the line to be screened. There are some fun shops here. We'll do fine. All right. He sounded skeptical, but Bobbi refused to be bothered by that. It took more than an hour to get through the long line to be screened. Look, she said with a grin, we've lasted an hour already. I'm glad you're having fun, he said. After putting their shoes back on, Bobbi headed for a newsstand. I want to see if they have this game I saw in one of these shops once. Gary couldn't help but be charmed by Bobbi's determination to have a good time while stuck at the airport. I'll wait here. Just realized I need to call the Airbnb people and tell them it'll be at least 24 hours before we can get there. Sounds good to me. Bobbi went into the shop and browsed, finally finding the getting to know you game she'd been looking for. She purchased it and some chocolate, because chocolate fixed everything, and then went back to Gary, who was just finishing up on the phone. I got it. And a million chocolate-covered raisins, because chocolate fixes the world, and raisins make them healthy. He raised an eyebrow. Chocolate is healthy? He wanted to laugh at her, but her face was so serious, he just couldn't. Sure, she said. But only when you combine it with fruit. I'm not sure I believe your reasoning, but I'll let it go just this once. Good of you, she said, grinning at him. I think so. He followed her to their gate, where no chairs were available. Looking around, there didn't seem to be chairs anywhere. Now what? She found a spot against a wall and plopped down on her bottom, crossing her legs in front of her. Now, we play the game I found and munch on chocolate-covered raisins. The raisins are purely for health purposes, of course. Oh, of course. He watched as she took a deck of cards out of the sack. What's the game? It's a getting-to-know-you card game. It's supposed to be 3 players. But one is a judge, so we'll write our answers. She pulled out a couple of pens and a pad of hotel paper from her purse. We'll look at the card, write our answers, and one of us will win unless the answer is the same. Whoever has the most cards at the end wins the game. He shrugged. Sounds easy. The first question gave Bobbi pause, but she quickly wrote her answer anyway. The question was, who was the oldest when they received their first kiss? Bobbi's answer was 28. The age she was now. She knew it was a ridiculous answer, and she didn't want to admit it, but she couldn't just not answer either. When he'd put his paper face down on hers, she read both. He'd written 16. I win this one, she said, crumpling the papers. I want to see what you wrote, he said. Aren't we supposed to be getting to know each other? She nodded. But my answer is embarrassing. He reached for her hand and removed the papers. 28? But didn't you tell me that I'm 28? Yeah, I did. My first kiss was yesterday. Well, I know there were a few yesterday. I think we might need one for today. Gary leaned toward her and brushed his lips across hers. I never imagined we'd be spending our honeymoon playing a game on the floor of the Salt Lake Airport. She smiled, glad the topic of her first kiss was over, but she made sure to take the card. Coming from a large family, she'd always been hyper-competitive. Me neither. I just hope we're not spending the whole thing here. He chuckled. I hope not as well. She turned over the next card. When was the first time you traveled out of your state? As they continued playing the game, she learned a lot about him, and he about her. They had time, so they played the entire deck before going to search for something to eat. Who won? She asked as he pulled her to her feet. We have to count the cards to find out. We know each other better, so I'd say we both won. Gary said, grinning at her. But, Bobbi knew he was right, but her competitive side didn't like it. Okay. She was incredibly disappointed they hadn't counted the cards, but she couldn't let it show. It painted her as something of a crazy woman, which she was. They walked leisurely to one of the sit-down restaurants in the airport. I never take the time to eat at an airport, he said. I'm always doing something, making business calls, talking to my mother. Mom says I never call her when I'm not traveling. Where do your parents live? She asked after they'd ordered. On a ranch outside Jackson, Wyoming. I grew up there. How many siblings do you have? She asked. She knew she'd talked about her own, but she couldn't remember if they'd talked about this. 2. Both sisters. I'm the baby, and they thought they were done, but Mom said I'm the best mistake she ever had. Bobbi laughed. Are you close to her? Mostly. She and Dad are amazing parents. If I ever worry about something, they're happy to listen. He shrugged. I think if they could have talked me into taking over the family ranch, they'd have been much happier, but I'm following my own dream. Does that put a strain on your relationship with them? He shook his head. Not at all. I just know they wish I'd followed a different route. It didn't keep them from supporting me every step of the way, though. Good. My parents were certain I should be a teacher. I babysat a lot growing up, but I never had the desire to teach. I do better as a concierge, which my parents seem to think is beneath me, but I sure don't. Parents are funny, aren't they? Bobbi bit her lip for a second. You want kids? She asked. Oh, yeah. Lots. A dozen would thrill me. I'm not sure about a dozen. We're starting a little late in life for that. But, 4 or 5 maybe? That would be good too, he said. Seriously, I want kids. At least a couple. I don't want to kill my wife in the process though. Pregnancies can be hard on a woman. They can, she agreed. Then we'll see what happens with that. Sounds good. Do you think we'll be happy in my house? Do you have a place? Yes and no. I think your house is fine unless we have more than a couple of kids. And I live with my parents. There was never a reason to move out. They have a 5-bedroom, and we kind of converted part of it into a little apartment for me. I have a fridge and a microwave and my own bathroom. It's worked out well for me. I don't blame you. Easier to save money that way. She nodded. Yeah, my only real bills are my car payment, insurance, and phone bill. I'm not an extravagant person, and all I've done for years is work, so there's plenty in savings at this point. Good. I save most of what I make too. I do so much for the restaurant that it's easier to just save. I figure I'll want a bigger place before long, and I want a big house on the hill. She smiled. Maybe near the entrance of Logan Canyon. Near the hotel. Sure, who wouldn't want that view every day of their lives? Their food was delivered then, and he waited until the server left before he finished what he was saying. I want a huge deck on the back of the house where I can sit and look out over the mountains every time I have a spare minute. Bobbi nodded. That sounds nice. But remember, you're going to have to keep that deck shoveled. That doesn't sound quite as nice, but I can manage that. As they ate, they discussed what each of them would put in their dream house. I want a game room, Bobbi said. A huge one, like with foosball and a pool table and a ping pong table. You're all about playing games, aren't you? She nodded. Growing up in a big family, we were always really competitive with one another. It feels like something families do. What did your family do together? We worked together all the time. My favorite time of year was Roundup because we'd get help from all the neighbors and hold a huge cookout and dance as a thank you. It was fun. Don't tell me, you did the cooking? I did. I think my love of cooking came from those cookouts. Even after my sisters were married and out of the house, they'd come back for Roundup and branding. Sounds fun to me, she said. Let's go for the next Roundup if we can. He smiled. I'd like that. We play horseshoes and cornhole and all the fun outside games during the cookout. My parents have always made it a huge, fun event. Let's do it then. I'll need dates as soon as you have them so I can ask for time off. I'll call Mom after we finish eating. Is she going to be mad that you didn't have her come to the wedding? He shook his head. Not at all. They wouldn't have been able to come down for it, and then they would have felt badly and would have tried to get me to have the wedding in Jackson, and then we'd be stranded in Jackson this weekend instead of Salt Lake. I have to say, if I'm going to be stranded with my bride, I don't want it to happen under my parents' watchful eyes. I don't blame you at all. I think I'd rather not be around my parents as we get to know each other either. My mom is certain you're a serial killer or something. Or maybe that's my dad. It's probably a shared belief. Gary nodded. If it were my daughter marrying a stranger, I'd be pretty darn worried as well. After their meal, they walked back and found their spot on the floor. No one was leaving because of the weather, so no one had vacated their seats. They sat with their backs to the wall, and Gary wrapped one arm around her, using the other to call his mother. Hey, Mom. I just wanted to let you know I got married yesterday. Bobbi felt him shake as he laughed quietly. I know it's a big surprise. Her name is Bobbi, and she's a concierge at a hotel in Logan. He paused for a moment. Yes, I plan to bring her to meet you. Not today, because we're stranded at the Salt Lake airport. I'm taking her to South Padre Island for our honeymoon. When he'd finally hung up 10 minutes later, he had the dates of the roundup for her. Will that work? He asked. I'll request the time. I've taken so little in the past 10 years that it should be just fine. I have an assistant I've trained, and she can take over for a week or so. Is that who's working for you now? He asked. Bobbi nodded. Yeah, Hannah's usually a front desk girl, but she's the best front desk girl, so we trained her for my job. She works whenever I'm not. I tend to work 6 days a week, so she works the 7th. And I do 7 days if she needs to be out for any reason. So, what days do you work? He asked. Monday through Saturday? She shook her head. Not usually. I'm there during the busiest days. So, I'm usually off on Wednesdays. He understood completely. I work a lot of Sundays too. I'll take a day off during the week if I feel things are going well. Never Friday though, because that's a busy day always. Maybe I'll start taking Wednesdays too. It would be nice to have time together. She nodded, smiling. I think that would be nice. Already she was more attracted to him than she'd imagined she would be. He was a good man, and pretty darned handsome too. She truly enjoyed spending time with him. The airport was noisy, and they watched people for a good long while. So many parents were starting to struggle with fussy children. As they watched, the airport slowly quieted down for the night. It seemed strange to sleep on the floor, but Bobbi didn't mind too much. It was a unique experience and would give her better perspective when guests complained about delayed flights. Finally, shortly after midnight, Bobbi's eyes drifted closed. She'd never been one who could sleep sitting up, but with Gary's shoulder for a pillow, she was able to drift off to sleep. Gary watched her eyes close and stroked her hair tenderly. Never in his life had he held a woman while she slept this way. He felt closer to her because she trusted him enough to sleep in his arms in a terribly uncomfortable situation. He wasn't sure how she trusted him so much yet, but he knew he could never do anything to betray that trust. He knew he'd made the right decision when he'd married her then. She looked so angelic in her sleep, and it didn't matter that there were still people stirring around them. She was his. Before falling asleep himself, he kissed her brow and smoothed her hair from her eyes. Hopefully they'd be sleeping in South Padre Island the following night, and they would be comforted by the sound of the waves crashing against the shore. As he closed his eyes, he envisioned the waves. He thought about what it would be like to make love to his bride on the beach, but he knew better. Even in South Padre, it might not be quite warm enough to swim so late in the fall. He hoped this late in the year would work out well for him. He could only dream of the fun he was going to have with this beautiful woman, over the next 2 weeks and over their entire lifetimes. Chapter 4. Bobbi woke up to people moving around in the terminal around her. She was still resting her head on Gary's shoulder, and she wished there was a place for her to shower before he woke up, but she knew better. They were still stranded. As she looked outside, though, she realized the snow had stopped. There were plows out on the tarmac clearing the snow away, and pilots were starting to arrive. She got up and moved to the sign at their gate. The flight was leaving in 2 hours. She used the restroom, brushing her hair, and then hurried back to Gary, who had slept through it all. Her mother had always told her that men slept a great deal more soundly than women, but this was the first time she'd seen it firsthand. She put her hand on his shoulder and shook him a bit. Gary. Wake up. He slowly opened his eyes, seeing her looking at him, and his lips curled into a smile. I'm awake. Good. The snow stopped, and our flight leaves in just 2 hours. Seriously? He asked, sitting up and staring out the window for a moment. You're right. It did. He got to his feet, flexing his shoulders. I'm not a fan of sleeping on the floor in airports. He hadn't felt this stiff since his first full day working in a restaurant. I don't blame you, she said with a smile. You up for some breakfast before the flight? He nodded. Sounds good. Let me just use the facilities, and I'll meet you back here in a minute or two, and we'll go in search of breakfast. While she waited, Bobbi checked her phone. Sure enough, there was a message from her mother. She'd learned the hard way to shut off her notifications while she slept. She listened to the message, and then called her mother back. There had been 15 texts from her mother as well. You're right about the storm. We spent the night at the airport in Salt Lake. That's terrible. Bobbi smiled. We actually had a pretty good time. We played a game and talked and got to know each other better. We're about to go for breakfast, and then our flight is leaving in a couple of hours. Has the snow stopped there? Her mother asked with surprise. It has. They're working on clearing the snow now. Well, that's good. It's still coming down pretty hard here. I hope it keeps going north then. Idaho can have it, Mom laughed. I'll gift wrap it for them. Just wanted to be sure you're all right. I'm fine. Bobbi smiled at Gary, who had just walked up to her. Gary's back, so I'm going to let you go. Be safe, her mother said. It's what she said every time they hung up after talking. I will. After ending the call, Bobbi looked at Gary. I had my notifications off, and my mother was certain you did me in. He laughed. I'm just not that kind of guy, I'm afraid. I can kill bugs, but that's about it. I will love you forever for killing bugs for me, she said with a laugh. Hey, that works for me. I thought I was going to have to wait and earn your love, but if you want to just give it now, I'll take it. She laughed, shaking her head. You have to work a little harder for it than that. She winked at him, letting him know she was joking. Never having been in love, she had no idea how she would know, but she figured it would hit her like a ton of bricks. After breakfast, they went back to the gate, and the sign said they were starting to board in 10 minutes. Bobbi was almost dancing on air. She was ready to get out of the cold of Utah and to the beach. Maybe it wouldn't be warm enough to swim, but she sure hoped it would. She glanced at her phone and decided to check the weather for the island. When she saw the answer, she squealed. It's going to be 82 degrees tomorrow in South Padre. I'm going swimming in the ocean. He laughed. I love ocean swimming. Body surfing is a lot of fun too. He couldn't wait for her to try all of the fun things they could do on South Padre. Have you ever tried a surfboard? Yeah. My buddy who I went to the island with always wanted to surf. We can rent boards there, and it's lots of fun, she clapped excitedly. I'm going to try to surf. It'll be fun, he said, smiling. He was glad she wasn't afraid of the ocean like she was afraid of heights. I can't wait. She turned to him and kissed him softly. Thanks for planning an amazing honeymoon for us. I hope it lives up to both of our expectations. Gary couldn't believe they'd been married for almost 2 full days and still hadn't made love. He planned to rectify that once they were in their romantic beach getaway. They couldn't get there soon enough. When they announced the first guest should get on the plane, Bobbi felt like cheering. We're finally leaving. I'm as excited as you are. But you've been there before. For me, it's a whole new world. She spread her arms as if she was going to sing, but when she clobbered an angry-looking man with one outstretched arm, she apologized and immediately drew her arms close to her body. She looked at Gary with her eyes wide, just to see him chuckling. Oops. Bobbi didn't respond, but she certainly kept her arms and hands to herself until they were on the plane. As usual, the airplane seats were cramped and uncomfortable, but she was so happy to be getting out of the airport, she couldn't complain. Thankfully, Gary had given her the aisle seat, and she had a little more space. Their connection, which had been changed to fit their new schedule, was tight, but they made it before the door closed. She leaned over to him as the plane took off, whispering, "We're finally going to get there. Barring any further tragedy, we will." She slept a lot on the second flight, finding her head flopping onto Gary's shoulder, and then she'd wake up, startled. "Sorry," she whispered for the 15th time. "Just use my shoulder as a pillow and sleep," he said. "Are you sure?" Bobbi felt badly that she couldn't stay awake to keep him company. "Positive. I've got a movie downloaded on my iPad, and I'm going to watch it. You sleep." She nodded, her head going to his shoulder, and she didn't wake until the flight attendant announced they were about to land. Wow. That was a fast flight. Yeah, it's only an hour and 11 minutes from wheels up to wheels down. She blinked a few times. I should have given in and used you as a pillow much sooner. He smiled, gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. I'm always happy to have you sleep on me. He wiggled his eyebrows at her, and she giggled. They made it through the terminal, picked up their luggage, and headed straight for the rental cars. We'll stop for lunch on our way to Port Isabel, he said. Sounds good. What's Port Isabel? That's where we take the bridge to South Padre. It's a huge, beautiful bridge. Sounds good to me. Will we stop soon? She asked, her stomach rumbling. He laughed. As soon as I have car keys in my hand, we'll find a place for lunch. Good. Anything sound good? Tex-Mex or barbecue would be my choices of food in Texas. She smiled. I'd happily take either one. Then let's do barbecue. We'll stop at a grocery store in Port Isabel. Then we can do breakfast and lunch in the condo and maybe go out for supper at night. Or I can cook everything. You don't expect me to cook anything? She asked. That would probably be for the best. You don't cook? He asked. She shrugged. I'm good with Kraft mac and cheese and microwave hot dogs. He raised an eyebrow. Why wasn't this fault relayed to me by Dr. Lachele? I guess she figured one of us could cook and that was enough. I'll teach you, he said. To cook? Bobbi shook her head. I'm not a fan of being in kitchens. You cook well enough for both of us. He filled out the information needed for their rental car, and they headed out to find the car that had been reserved for them. Don't think we're not going to revisit this topic as soon as possible. What topic? She asked, grinning at him. Gary sighed. You really don't have any desire to learn to cook? I really don't. I'm great with a takeout menu or something I can throw in the oven. Who needs more than that in today's world? What about breakfast? He asked. Haven't you ever heard of McDonald's drive-thru? You can't feed my children McDonald's. Then you'd better start making little frozen sandwiches for me to feed them for breakfast. Or you can go to work later in the day and cook for us. Your choice. Bobbi could tell she was getting his goat, but it was too much fun to stop. Besides, if we have a kid, they won't be on solids for at least 2 years. Maybe by then you can convince me of the evils of fast food. Gary frowned at her. I can't tell if you're teasing me or not. Only half. I'm a terrible cook, but I'm willing to learn to make a few basic things since it's so important to you. They left the airport and started looking for food. There we go. Decent barbecue, he said, refusing to continue on that topic with her. They found a little hole-in-the-wall barbecue restaurant and went inside, happy that they'd arrived after the lunch rush. It's got to be over 80 degrees. Bobbi said. You told me it was going to be 82 in South Padre, he said, wondering why she was so surprised. I was sure it had to be wrong. It's gorgeous. They took a seat and looked over the menu. I don't know what I want, she said. Anything. Texas barbecue is to die for, and I don't care where in Texas you buy it. It's just going to be good. She settled on grilled chicken and a potato casserole. Sounded good to her. After the server left their drinks, she stretched out. It almost feels weird to not be in an airport after 24 hours of travel. He smiled. I know, I'm glad to stretch my legs though. Really, he was thrilled to be able to be alone with her without half of Salt Lake City's population watching them. He had only planned to wait a day or two before making love, and here they were on day 3 of being married, and he felt no closer to their wedding night than he had been when he'd kissed her at the church. While they ate, he told her all the things he loved about the island. It's a huge summer break place, at least for Texas universities. So, you can't walk into one of their t-shirt shops with a kid because the language is bad. I love all the souvenir shops, though. Silly Oceanwide remembrances. We'll walk early one morning and see if we can find some seashells. In his mind, he pictured a perfectly idyllic vacation with his beautiful new wife. What could possibly go wrong in a tropical nirvana like South Padre? Sounds fun to me, she said. But I really don't think I can do the parasailing thing with you. I've been thinking about it the whole time, and it would scare me too much. She had to fight not to shudder as she thought about it. No, heights were not for her. He sighed. I thought a girl like you would be all about conquering her fears. I mean, you're so competitive. I can do it, so why can't you? Because it's scary, she said, sticking her tongue out at him. All right. But then there will be pictures of me from our honeymoon sailing through the sky, and when people ask why there are none of you, what will you say? The sky was scary that day? She wanted to tell him that he was way off base with her, but she couldn't. Fine, I'll do it, but if I die, you have to convince my parents I wasn't a victim of your dastardly deeds. She hated herself for being so easily played, but she just couldn't imagine not doing it. Not with the way he was talking to her about it. It was like when she'd played truth or dare with a group of neighborhood children, and she had never been able to back down from a dare. The food was certainly the best barbecue she'd ever eaten. It was all she could do not to moan as she ate her first bite of chicken. This stuff is amazing. He grinned, waving one of his ribs as he talked. I told you. I can cook some mean barbecue, but nothing like this. We'll have to do cookouts in the summers. I'd like that a lot. Bobbi loved that they were planning their future as they enjoyed each other's company. Maybe she'd been crazy to marry a stranger, but this was a stranger she liked a lot. She could see herself falling in love with him. Besides, with as much as they both worked, their plans were probably pie in the sky anyway. Who had time for cookouts? It's another 40 minutes or so to the island from here. I figure we'll stop and get a bunch of groceries and then not leave the island for a couple weeks if we can get away with it. What could go wrong? Gary shrugged. Stuff can always go wrong. One of us could get sick. A jellyfish sting. So many things. We could crash while parasailing, she said, shivering at the idea. I'm not sure I can do it. It wasn't like her to back out of anything, but parasailing sounded positively stupid with her fear of heights. I know you can, he said. I'll cook every meal the entire time we're here if you do it. That's too tempting to pass up. Am I allowed to keep my eyes closed? Sure. Wouldn't bother me a bit. After lunch, they got back in the car and headed toward Port Isabel. Driving from Brownsville, which was on the Mexican border, they headed toward the ocean. There were palm trees everywhere, and Bobbi was certain she could smell the ocean. It was such a special feeling to know she was driving toward beautiful blue water that would go as far as the eye could see, and she would be there in a very short while. She could see the bridge they would cross when they reached the grocery store. Somehow, he'd magicked up a list and took her hand. We need everything on here. Do you want to split it or walk together? Let's just walk together, she said. He bought ingredients she'd never even heard of, but she didn't care. As long as she didn't have to cook, he could buy whatever ingredients floated his boat. Ooh, could we rent a boat when we get there? Go out on the ocean a little? He nodded. Don't see why not. I've actually seen someone catch a shark from the beach there. It's an amazing place. His voice sounded more excited by the minute. She loved listening to him talk about his favorite vacation destination. He seemed to be just as thrilled to discuss the island as he was talking about food. I can't wait to see it. And you said we're right on the beach, she asked. Yup. The condo has a glass door. You go out the door, walk forward for about a minute, and you're at the ocean. And there aren't nearly as many people there in the fall as there are in the summer and spring break. Spring break is seriously their busiest time of the year. Is there a pool too? Like for lap swimming? Well, of course, pool, ocean, everything we need. There's even a jacuzzi tub in the room. Bobbi sighed. And you're making me go home? The condo sounded like a tropical paradise she would never want to leave. We'll be sick of sun and sand after 2 weeks, won't we? I'm not so sure. Once the car was filled with the groceries, and they were on their way to the island, she watched much more closely as they crossed the bridge. Oh, my goodness! How far across is this bridge? It's actually called a causeway, but it looks like a bridge to me. It's about 2 miles long. You'll see the island in a minute. From the vantage point of the bridge, she could see the island was thin, but incredibly long. Why is it shaped that way? Nature made it. Men split South Padre from Padre Island, but it was always that skinny. It's called a barrier island. I had no idea. Is this the only island in Texas? Oh, heavens no. There are at least 50, but I think there are more. Texas has a long coastline, and there are lots of islands just floating out there. There are even some islands and lakes around the state. I've been to Galveston as well, but I have to say, this is my favorite. Well, I'm glad you're sharing it with me then. He drove off the causeway and onto South Padre itself, driving down one street. Is this the only street on the island? She asked. It's the main one. Everything happens here. There are smaller streets, but nothing is more than a couple of blocks from this street. He pulled into a condominium complex and jumped out, leaving the car running. Wait here. I'll get the keys and be back in a minute. She waited in the car, texting her mother that they'd arrived safely on the island for their honeymoon. Knowing her mother, she'd worry every minute she was gone otherwise. Gary came out and climbed into the car, driving around the side of the building. This beach is private for the people staying here. Our condo is just around that corner. All we have to do is unload, and then we can play. She glanced at the time on her phone. It wasn't even 5 in the evening, and they'd had a late lunch, so she wasn't terribly concerned about dinner yet. Let's unload and then walk down to the beach. That's the first thing I always want to do as well. I'd say we could wait to unload, but we have perishables in the car. She shook her head. Work before fun. Always. Her parents had ingrained that simple rule into her from the time she could walk, and she would never stray from it. One of those, are you? She nodded emphatically. You're not? I try to be, but there are days when fun comes before work. I'll have to whip everyone back into shape when we get home, I'm sure, but I'll put fun first here. Gary unlocked the door, and she dragged in one of the suitcases. There were 2 bedrooms. Where am I sleeping? She asked. She waited to be told she was sleeping alone again, and she steeled herself for disappointment. I was hoping we could both sleep in the master bedroom. Bobbi smiled. I'd like that a lot. Chapter 5. After unloading the car, they changed into clothes that suited the Texas weather better than the winter where they'd gone to the airport in. Walking along the beach was pure joy for Bobbi and Gary. She carried her sandals in one hand while jumping in and out of the waves, squealing when her feet were touched by the cool ocean water. I have never been on an ocean before. You'd think we'd have gone when I was little, and we visited my Uncle Bob in San Antonio. He nodded. Were you named after your Uncle Bob? I was. He was Robert Jean, and I'm Roberta Jean. I always felt a special connection with Uncle Bob. He died of a heart attack a few years back, and I was just devastated. Bobbi stopped walking and turned to the ocean, staring out at the endless water. It was harder losing him than it was losing my grandparents, oddly enough. He walked to her and wrapped an arm around her. I'm sorry you lost him. I would have liked to meet him. Oh, he was this big burly man whose voice sounded like a growl. He was as different from my father as night and day, but they were so close growing up. Uncle Bob went to college in San Antonio and met the love of his life. They visited often, but it was never the same. Did Uncle Bob have kids? He asked. She nodded. 3 of them. My cousin Lily is just a year older than me, and we were super close growing up. Now it's weird when we see each other, and I'm not really sure why. I'm sorry. Me too. She continued walking, her feet sinking into the sand, and the water washing over her feet. Your shoes are getting nasty. He shrugged. There's a washer in the condo. I'll wash them before we head home. I'll wash them. Cleaning should be my job if you're going to do all the cooking, she told him. I'm not going to argue with that. Gary was surprised she was so willing to do the cleaning, but he was thrilled. It would be a lot easier for him. He wasn't a messy man, so the cleaning shouldn't be major anyway. When they had walked about a mile down the beach, he smiled. Do you want to walk up here? There's a little restaurant that I enjoy. I'll start cooking tomorrow. What kind of food? She asked. We're on the beach. We're eating seafood. He headed in the direction of the main street they'd driven down, which made sense to Bobbi. It was where the food would be. Bobbi smiled. Shrimp and lobster keep me going. They have both. Or they did 6 years ago, which was the last time I was here. I love their food. Very well done. You've convinced me. I'll eat what I want, and then we'll walk it off as we go back to the condo. Perfect. Gary was thrilled she was so easygoing about food. So far, he hadn't found anything she turned her nose up at. The restaurant was casual, and they chose a table outside. While she decided which kind of shrimp she wanted, he perused the menu as well, thinking about having steak and lobster. It just sounded perfect to him. He knew the lobster tails there were fresh and delicious. Finally, she looked up. I'm trying to decide if I want to do just shrimp and lobster, or steak and lobster. I'm in Texas. I feel like I should eat at least one steak. He chuckled. Whatever you want, but I'm getting the steak and lobster. Then I will too. And we can come back since we'll be here for 2 weeks. Very true. I happen to know that this restaurant is owned and run by a family. The man's brother is a shrimp fisherman. He brings in all the shrimp they make here. His son is a lobsterman, and they use only his lobster. They really do it well. Bobbi smiled. You've sold me. Stop trying to make my mouth water. When the server came to the table, Bobbi ordered the steak and lobster. How do you want your steak? Well done. Not even a sliver of pink. Bobbi couldn't handle underdone meat. Gary looked at Bobbi like she'd lost her mind. I want the same, but I want my meat rare. It's hard for me to understand why someone would burn a perfectly good steak. Bobbi shuddered at the very thought. As soon as the server, whose name tag read Connor, walked away, she looked at Gary. Please make sure you brush your teeth 6 times before kissing me. I cannot stand undercooked meat. Same goes for you. I hate when it's burnt. He shook his head. When I grill out for us, are you going to want me to burn your steaks? Yes. Abso-absolutely. No doubt in my mind. I see a tiny bit of pink and I send it back to be cooked right. He sighed. I'm going to have to teach you how to eat a steak, I see. No, because I'm perfectly comfortable with my culinary choices. But your choices are wrong. He'd never dreamed he'd marry someone who knew so little about the proper way to enjoy food. He had to do something to help her see the light. She smiled slightly. My choices aren't wrong. They're just not the same as yours. We're going to have to agree to disagree for now. One more thing on the subject and then I'll leave it alone. Every chef I've ever worked with has told me that the correct way to cook a steak is rare. There's no reason to do it any other way. Unless you can't stand the idea of blood in your mouth, and it makes you gag to think about eating food that bleeds. Gross. I understand that, he said. But you'll have to get over it so you can eat steak correctly. I'm not having this discussion. She picked up her phone and went to a game she'd been playing for months, but felt like she never really had time for. If he was going to lecture her about her eating habits, then she would disappear behind her phone. He watched her for a moment before picking up his own phone. 2 could play at that game. When their food arrived, they ate it in silence. The steaks were served with butter dripping off them, and they just melted in Bobbi's mouth. The lobster tail was perfectly done, and the baked potato that came with it all just made the meal perfect. When they were finished, she still had half her steak, so she asked Connor for a box, filling it with her leftovers. Gary watched her put her steak and part of the lobster tail into her box. I'll show you how to reheat that when we get back to the condo, he said quietly. I'd appreciate that. Bobbi couldn't believe the man was so stubborn over something she thought of as a matter of taste. He was unbelievable. As they walked back toward the condo, he held her hand, and she allowed it. She was still annoyed with him, but she wasn't going to let it ruin their night together. "So, what do you want to do tonight?" she asked. "I would like to stay in and maybe catch a movie. I know the television is set up for Netflix. We can choose something or find something on cable. They have all the movie channels, so there's bound to be something we can agree on." She nodded. "I suppose there is." When they got back to the condo, she slipped her leftovers into the fridge. "I'm going to shower really quick before we watch anything." She figured she'd put her jammies on after the shower, and she could be comfortable while they watched. He nodded. "You should try out the jetted tub instead. If you like baths, that is. My sisters always loved them." "I do love baths. I don't love being compared to your sisters." She closed the door and turned on the tap, determined to make him wait. She'd planned to take a shower so he wouldn't have to wait for her. Now she didn't care. That was the second time in the first 48 hours of their marriage he'd compared her to his sisters. He really needed a lesson in how to treat women. She dumped a little bit of her shampoo into the tub and turned the jets on, loving the bubbles that were created in the process. She leaned against the back of the tub and just soaked. Loving baths, she sometimes took an hour or two to soak away her troubles. When she had time, which was rarely, she'd take advantage of tub time there. It was a little over an hour before she joined Gary in the living room, sitting on the couch beside him. "Did you decide what to watch?" she asked. "I figured we'd go for an old chick flick. How about Sleepless in Seattle?" "I'm really not into chick flicks. I love old musicals though." "Any of those?" "I like old musicals too. And I hate chick flicks. I was just trying to make you happy." Gary flipped through the channels wondering if there was anything he could say or do that would make her stop being so angry with him. "Well, this way we can both be happy." She felt her heart melt a little. He was going to watch something he didn't like to please her. That was worth some good brownie points as far as she was concerned. "My Fair Lady is playing in 10 minutes. "Perfect. We got microwave popcorn, didn't we?" "I'll get it. You just wait here." He hurried to the kitchen, happy that they were agreeing on something to watch. It felt like a turning point to him. While she waited, Bobbi played on her phone for a minute, immediately answering her mother's text asking if she was still alive. "Mom, you can't ask me that every 2 hours. Gary's a nice guy. He could just kill you and you could be lost at sea." "He won't." "Bye, Mom. Be careful." Gary walked into the room, seeing her thumbs flying over the text message screen. "Who are you texting?" he asked. "My mother. She's texting every couple of hours to make sure I'm still alive, and if I don't answer, her texts become pretty frantic. I told her my phone notifications are off until I get home, but she's still texting." "Oh, brother. We'll have to have them over for dinner after we get home so they can see I'm not a psycho." "Sounds good to me. I don't know if I should feel bad for her for being so worried, or bad for myself, because she's being a pain in my butt." Bobbi shook her head. "She's always been overprotective. You're the baby. Just like I am. I think she'll live if you don't respond right away." Gary set the bowl of popcorn between them and handed her a can of the root beer she'd requested. As the show came up on the screen, she smiled. "I hope you don't mind if I sing along. This is one of my favorites." He did mind, but he thought it was better if he didn't tell her that. They'd fought enough for the day. He wasn't sure why everything wasn't just moving along smoothly, but hopefully it would after they'd had sex. Maybe it was just sexual frustration and not true incompatibility. She sang the first song, and sang it terribly off-key, but her joy in the movie made it bearable. Just barely. By the time the song, "I Could Have Danced All Night," came on, the popcorn was gone, and she pulled him to his feet, and they danced to the music, while she sang loudly and off-key. He danced readily, but he wished he'd thought to bring earplugs for the songs. The woman really couldn't sing. At the very end of the movie, when it felt like Eliza was selling her soul to Professor Higgins, Bobbi sighed. "I hate this ending. I always have. I can understand that." Gary wrapped his arm around her as the show ended and turned to kiss her. She'd said she was fine with sharing his bed that night, and though they'd had some rough moments throughout the day, the movie had been wonderful. Bobbi kissed him back eagerly, loving every moment of his touch. They sat there, facing one another on the couch, kissing and stroking each other for a while before Gary said, "Can we move this show to the bedroom?" "Absolutely. That sounds wonderful to me." He took her hand and led her into the bedroom, closing the door behind him. Why he bothered, he wasn't sure, but it didn't feel right to leave it open. What if someone walked in? It would feel like he was the hero in a romance novel and people were reading about his first time with his wife. That would never do. Turning back to Bobbi, he pulled her pajama shirt over her head. He'd realized some time before that she wasn't wearing a bra underneath, and she stood in front of him, not at all embarrassed by her nudity. Within minutes, they were both undressed and lying on the bed together. He stroked her breast and took her nipple into his mouth, to suckle. Her hands went to the back of his head and wound through his hair. It all felt so good, and she knew she she needed him. When he covered her body with his and joined them for the first time ever, she let out a gasp of pain, but he remained still while she got used to him. Soon, though, he was moving inside her and driving her toward a climax she knew had to be close. When she let out a cry of fulfillment, he let himself go, moving quicker inside her until he reached his pinnacle as well. When he moved off her, he lay on his back, staring up at the ceiling, panting hard. "Well, Dr. Lachele certainly got that part of our compatibility right, didn't she? And nothing else?" Bobbi felt as if a knife had been thrust into her. He only thought they were compatible for sex. She'd thought they'd mostly had a wonderful time together. No, so many other ways, but we're just getting to know each other. Gary knew he'd messed up, and he needed to fix things before she was too angry with him to remain in bed. He was certain in a few hours he'd be looking for an encore, and he didn't want her in the other bedroom. "I suppose." He kissed her softly. "Good night, Bobbi." "Good night." Long after she heard his snores, Bobbi lay awake in bed, thinking about what he'd said. Were they really so incompatible he didn't think they should be together? What was wrong with her? Early the next morning, Gary slipped out of bed and went to the kitchen to start breakfast. French toast and bacon. Bacon was a happy food and the perfect way to start the first full day of their honeymoon. He'd just finished setting the table and putting the last of the French toast onto the stack with the rest of it, when Bobbi came out of the bedroom, wearing nothing but a flimsy robe. He looked at her and felt himself come to attention. "You're just as beautiful in the morning. Don't lie to me. I know how bad I look in the mornings." She yawned behind her hand. "I'm going to potty and brush my teeth. Be there in a minute." He smiled at her use of the word potty. It was cute in his eyes. When she came back, he was sitting at the table, fixing his French toast with syrup and butter. "This is my idea of a heavenly breakfast. No fast food." She smiled. "I guess I could get used to eating this way." He shook his head. "Get used to it? Everyone should eat a hearty breakfast in the mornings. I usually just grab something on my way to work. I know it's not the healthiest way to do things, but it's fast and I can eat at my desk. If I make breakfast in the mornings, would you get up 15 minutes earlier than usual to eat with me?" She cocked her head to one side, thinking about it. "All right. I could do that." "Good. With as busy as it sounds like we'll both be, I think I'll keep my cleaning lady on. She comes in twice a week and deals with everything I let go. I'm not messy, but I don't have time to wash my sheets or scrub my toilets. Works for me. I would be thrilled not to have to do those things." She took a sip of the coffee he'd put in front of her. "What do you want to do today?" "I thought we'd go parasailing. We'll get it out of the way, and then you don't have to dread it the whole time we're here." Bobbi groaned. "If you weren't so insistent that I do it with you, I wouldn't have to dread it either. You'll love it once you're up there. There's nothing in the whole world like it. If God had meant for me to fly, I would have feathers." He grinned at her, taking her hand and kissing the palm. "Remember our deal?" "I remember. I'll do it, but I'm not going to like it." Sure, you will, how could you not? He knew with everything inside him that if she just gave parasailing a chance, she'd love it as much as he did. Chapter 6. Gary and Bobbi walked to the dock where they did the parasailing, and Bobbi tried to talk him out of it the entire way. I really don't think you understand how afraid of heights I am. She knew if she tried this, she would turn into a stark raving lunatic, and that wasn't something she wanted her new husband to see. You were fine on the plane. The plane is a giant piece of metal that would protect me some if I fell. If I fall while parasailing, there's nothing but the ground. You'd land in the ocean, he said. Doesn't make me feel any better, she said. He'd told her to wear her swimsuit and a shirt over the top, so she had, but she felt strangely naked. She would do just about anything to get out of their deal at that moment. When they got to the men who drove the boat that dragged the people behind it, causing them to lift off into the air, he waved in greeting. Their name tags read Roy and Thomas. My new wife is afraid to go parasailing, but I keep telling her the view is amazing. Gary told them. Roy smiled. I think it is. I cannot imagine not going at least once in my life. Thomas just nodded. He was obviously the quiet one of the two partners. Well, we're both going. Gary dug out his wallet and handed the men a credit card. Charge us for 2 singles. Roy nodded. It's easier if you go up together. Especially if one of you is afraid of heights. It'll be more fun if we can watch each other and take pictures. I think Bobbi needs to go first, though. She is too afraid to be able to watch me and then go up. Thomas brought out a life vest which he gave Bobbi and she strapped it on gratefully. Then he started attaching wires to the life vest while she shook in fear. As soon as she was ready, Thomas jumped into the boat while Roy gave her the instructions. When she was in the boat with Thomas, she bowed her head and started praying that she would survive the experience without losing her mind. What was she thinking doing something this crazy? Before she knew what was happening, her feet were off the ground, and she went up high into the air. For the first second or two, she loved the feeling of weightlessness, and then she looked down, and that was her mistake. She closed her eyes tightly and held on to the ropes of the parachute which rose high above her. After a moment, she started chanting to herself, I'm going to kill Gary. I'm going to kill Gary. She wouldn't, but in that moment, if she'd had a knife and he was within arm's reach, she may have cut him just a little. When she felt herself falling toward the ocean or ground or whatever was under her, and she didn't know because she wasn't about to look, she let out a little scream and immediately bit her lip. She didn't want him to know how much it had frightened her, even though she'd told him over and over it would. Finally, she was dipped into the water and then landed in the boat. She was still shaking as Thomas skillfully navigated the boat to the shore. When she stepped out of the boat, Gary smiled at her. You looked great up there. She nodded. I'll take pictures while you go up. She had nothing else to say to him at that moment because she knew if she opened her mouth, she would be spitting verbal sludge at him with every word. Gary looked at her in confusion before he went to take his turn in the boat and in the air. She carefully took pictures of everything he did, knowing how important the photographs would later be to him, and when he'd landed, he asked if she wanted him to cook, or if she wanted to eat out. I don't care at all. Bobbi wasn't going to make anything easy on him after he'd all but forced her to go parasailing, even knowing she was deathly afraid. Gary frowned. Are you mad at me? Bobbi stopped walking and glared at him. Let's see, you all but forced me to go parasailing after I told you repeatedly that I'm afraid of heights. I almost threw up and had to keep my eyes tightly closed. I saw myself falling and plummeting to my death over and over. So, yeah, I'm a little mad at you. She turned to walk in the direction of the condo. You know what? No, I'm a whole heck of a lot more than a little mad. I'm absolutely furious. You need to learn to take no for an answer. There was a perfectly good reason I didn't want to do it, and I felt like I had to with the way you kept at me about it. I hated every second of it. Never again will you do that to me. Gary hurried to keep up with her. She was walking faster and faster, the angrier her tone got. I didn't mean to upset you. I was sure you'd like it as much as I do. Even though I told you over and over that I would hate it. You don't get to decide what I will or won't like. Ever. You're being a bully, and I won't stay married to a bully. They'd reached the condo, and she had to wait for him to open the door and let her in. I have no desire to talk to you right now. I have to tell my mother I'm still alive. With that, she went into the spare room and slammed the door behind her. The man was absolutely insufferable, and she didn't want to spend another minute with him. She threw herself down on the bed and sobbed. The experience had taken so much out of her, and the utter fear she'd felt had not been worth it. Maybe it wasn't logical to blame it all on Gary, but he'd been the one who had insisted over and over. She couldn't ever let him do that to her again. She didn't know how long she lay there crying, but finally, Gary knocked on the door. I made chicken soup and grilled cheese. Nothing fancy, but those are my comfort foods. Bobbi didn't bother to tell him that she wouldn't need comfort foods if he hadn't talked her into doing something she was desperately afraid of, but there was no need. He already knew that. Thanks. She was surprised to realize she was hungry. She sat down at the table and waited for him to sit as well. Taking a big bite of the soup, she was surprised at how good the flavor was. This is good, she said softly. She didn't want to compliment him, or ever talk to him again, but she couldn't not tell him how good the meal he'd made for her was. I'm glad you like it. He sat and watched her eat for a moment before picking up his spoon. I will never do that to you again. I'm so sorry, I was just so convinced that if you tried it, you'd love it as much as I do, and I was terribly wrong. I hope you can forgive me. I can, eventually. Forgiveness is something I always need to work on. I tend to hold a grudge for 63 years. But you're only 28. Exactly. She took another bite of the soup. I'll get over it. He frowned. Do you want to do something calmer later today? Play miniature golf maybe? Or shop in the souvenir shops? She shrugged. At the moment, I want to loll about and cry a little more, but I know that's not the healthy answer. Let's golf. I'd like that a lot. She took one bite of her sandwich and sighed contentedly. What is in this? I use whole grain bread, cheddar cheese, and pimento cheese. Yummy, isn't it? It's absolutely wonderful. She took another big bite. I had no idea how hungry I was. She'd been too busy crying to care about what her stomach needed. She'd probably have lain there for another hour or two if he hadn't offered food. Well, I'm glad it's hitting the spot. Definitely. She couldn't quite meet his eyes, because of how embarrassed and upset he'd made her that morning. He realized what was wrong as she avoided his gaze, and he wanted to kick himself for the way he'd treated her. I'll do the dishes if you want to freshen up or something. She gave a self-deprecating laugh. I'm sure I look like a huge mess. My eyes are burning. I think you look beautiful. I just thought you might want to wash your face or something. As soon as she was done eating, Bobbi went into the bathroom and put a cold rag on her face. She felt gross, and she didn't like it one bit. When the puffiness around her eyes had gone down a little, she changed into a pair of shorts and a tank top before slathering sunscreen all over her torso and face, then sitting down and rubbing her legs with it. She was going to be a mess if she didn't cover herself with the stuff. She didn't burn and tan. She burned, and then there was another layer of burns over the first. The burns went on forever. Well, until they all started peeling off, that was. She walked into the kitchen as he was finishing up the dishes. I'm ready when you are, she said softly. He nodded, putting the last of the dishes into the dishwasher. Let's head out. I figure I'll do chicken on the grill and maybe some potato salad for supper, if that sounds good. Depends on what you put in your potato salad. If there's even a hint of pickles, I'm out. Pickles and potato salad was the devil's food, and not in the way deviled eggs were either. Deviled eggs were delicious. Pickles and potato salad, or anything else for that matter, should be banned from existence for all eternity. Or longer. Longer would be good. Gary smiled, glad to see she was back to normal. Not in my potato salad. I don't think pickles go with the other tastes. Bobbi nodded. You are a wise man. She could easily fall in love with a man who didn't put pickles in and on everything under the sun. They walked to the miniature golf course, and she chose a purple ball while he chose red. It wasn't even close. He obviously hadn't grown up competing against his siblings in such a fun game. When she made her third hole-in-one on the last hole, he groaned. You have to be cheating. How can I cheat? She knew she should probably mention that she'd been golfing her entire life and had gone to college on a golf scholarship. He didn't need to know that just yet. I'm still trying to figure that out, he said, scowling slightly. Just admit defeat. When you play against someone with superior skills, it's the only way to go. She grinned at him, feeling a little vindicated after clobbering him with her golf skills. I guess I'll admit defeat then. Is there a penalty for playing so poorly, oh queen of the golf balls? She put a finger to the side of her face, considering. I will have to think on this. But remember, you owe me a penalty, and it will come when you least expect it. He seemed to be trying to get her to be happy again, and it was working. There was just something about Gary that she found heartwarming. They returned their golf clubs and walked back toward the condo. What are you thinking for this afternoon? We could play in the ocean, rent surfboards. Whatever you want. Gary wasn't about to even suggest something after how rough a time she'd had that morning. Let's surf. I'd love to try it. We're on the side of the ocean and not on the Texas side, so the waves should be nice and big. Sounds good to me. There's a surf shop up ahead on our left. We'll stop in and ask about renting them. I know they usually do weekly rentals with no problem. They went into the surf shop, and she tried not to stare at some of the Fowler t-shirts there. Some of them were truly offensive. Thankfully, they did have week-long rentals of the surfboards. We want 2 weeks, he said. Can we pick any? The man behind the counter, Stuart, nodded, looking terribly bored. Anything along this wall. As Bobbi looked at the boards along the indicated wall, she found one that was a starburst of pink along a background of purple. This one, she said, smiling. I like this one. The man nodded. You need surf lessons? Gary shook his head. No, I can teach her. He chose a board that was different shades of blue, and they carried them out of the store after he'd paid. Each had a surfboard tucked under one arm. As they walked back to the condo, he gave her instructions on how to use a surfboard. I'd rather you wore a life jacket when you surf. I always do. She shrugged. Sure, it doesn't matter to me. Truthfully, she'd feel safer with a life jacket. Safety was important to Bobbi. Probably because her mother had drilled safety into her so much over the years. Good. We'll plan that then. When we get back, I need to go ahead and make the potato salad, and then we'll go down to the beach and try to catch a wave. You're going to love surfing. Yeah, that's what you said about parasailing, Bobbi said dryly. She hadn't meant for the words to come out, but she couldn't regret them too much. I'm still really sorry for that, he said. She nodded. I'm going to catch a soak while you make the potato salad. I love the bathtub here. Have fun. This time she took her iPad into the bath with her, knowing she would spend all her time reading. She loved to read. She thought about listening to the audiobook she was in the middle of, but decided she'd rather read instead. She had no idea how long she was in there when Gary knocked on the door. Salad is chilling in the fridge. I'll be right out, she called. She put her iPad on the back of the commode and stood up, drying off quickly. She wrapped her towel around her as she went into the bedroom she was sharing with Gary. I need a swimsuit. I'm glad I brought 4. I didn't know how many I'd need. Why do you have 4 swimsuits? He asked. She shrugged. I like how different ones fit. He shrugged, sitting down on the bed to watch her change. She turned and looked at him. I'm not putting on a show here. I'm your husband, and I think you're beautiful. One little show for me? Gary gave her a lopsided grin, and she sighed. You're silly. Nah. I just know that I like what I see. If it bothers you, I'll go in the other room, but we are married after all. Whatever. It felt weird putting on her suit with him watching her, but he was right. They were married, and it wasn't as if he'd never seen her in nothing. It would be fine. When she was finished dressing, she dug in her bag and found a band for her hair. She pulled it back into a ponytail, so it would be out of the way. She was doing something new in the water, and it would be smart if she could see what she was about to do. "I like your hair long," he said. "I'll make a note of that. I typically wear it up for work, though. And I'll wear it up for surfing. I don't want hair in my eyes." She was still annoyed enough with him to not care about his hair preferences at the moment, though she'd mostly forgiven him. Mostly. He sighed. "I can't argue with reason." Bobbi just shook her head as she headed for the door, grabbing her surfboard and a life jacket on the way. Chapter 7. Bobbi had a great time surfing with Gary. She was dumped into the water by waves more times than she could count, but it was all fun. After they were tired, they collapsed on the beach for a while before going to the condo so Gary could start the chicken on the grill. "Anything I can do to help?" she asked. She picked a piece of seaweed out of her hair and cringed a little. "Other than shower?" He laughed. "Shower. I'll get everything started. Do you want to eat outside or in?" "In. Maybe we can find another musical to watch after we eat." She went into the bathroom and showered quickly, washing her hair 3 times to make sure all the sea slime was out of it. She loved the ocean, but swimming pools felt so much more sanitary to her. Must be the chlorine. She went out as Gary was carrying the chicken into the house. She quickly set the table and got the potato salad out. Grabbing them each a can of pop, she collapsed in one of the chairs. "It's been an eventful day," she told him. "Can we shop some tomorrow? I want to get a few postcards to send home." He nodded. "Sure. I like to shop in the mornings when it's a little cooler." "Sounds good. I may want some time in the pool tomorrow. Finding so much slime in my hair kind of grossed me out." She loved surfing enough that she'd put up with it though. He laughed. "I don't blame you. But to me, you looked like a mermaid. I guess I could lure you to your death if you wanted." "Not necessary." Gary spooned some of the potato salad onto his plate and watched as she did the same. When she took her first bite, she smiled and nodded. "Seems like we have very similar food tastes except when it comes to how steaks need to be cooked. And I'm not changing, so don't start in on me again." Her big complaint about Gary was that he didn't let things go. She wasn't really allowed an opinion if he had a strong one, unless hers agreed with his. He sighed. "I know I come across really strong on some topics. Food is more than a passion of mine, and I hate to see people eat it in a way I don't like. But I also realize I was being ridiculous yesterday." Good. He had been ridiculous, she thought. About that and the stupid parasailing, she still didn't understand why that was so incredibly important to him. She took a bite of her chicken and smiled. "Cooked perfectly. I'm glad you don't dump a ton of sauce all over everything." "Nah. If it's cooked right, there's no need to use any kind of sauce most of the time." After their meal, she washed the dishes, and then they settled together on the couch with his arm around her shoulders. "Let's see what we can find," Gary said, picking up the remote. "How do you get a man to do sit UPS?" Bobbi asked. He shook his head. "How?" "Put the remote control between his toes." "That's just mean," he said. "But true." Bobbi grinned, quite happy. He didn't respond as he flicked through the channels with a purpose. Finally, he settled. "Kiss Me, Kate?" She nodded. "I've only seen that one once, and it was a really long time ago." "Perfect. Starts in 5 minutes." They chatted about surfing for a bit, and he gave her a couple of suggestions that would help her to ride the waves a little longer. "I think you're doing great for a beginner. I really enjoy it. I'd love to spend at least an hour a day working on surfing. Maybe I can get better before we go home." She sighed. "Maybe we should move to a beach location. I can work for any hotel." He chuckled. But my business would fall apart without me. It's important that I'm there daily, and it wouldn't be possible to make that happen from a beach location. Maybe, she said, smiling at him. The show started then, and they watched intently. He was thrilled to realize she didn't know all the words to the songs, because it was like listening to nails on a chalkboard. Once the show was over, he took her to their room, and made sweet love to her. He was a little surprised she didn't stop him after the morning they'd had, but she seemed to be feeling better toward him. As they lay together limply in bed afterward, she sighed. That was nice. We'll have to do it again someday. Maybe in an hour or two, he suggested. I could probably be talked into that. With her head pillowed on his shoulder, she fell asleep quickly, which was good as she hadn't slept well the night before. She'd been too worried that they were only compatible in bed. By the end of the first week, Bobbi was able to stay on her feet longer on the surfboard, and Gary praised her for how well she was doing. It took me 4 visits here to learn what you figured out in a week. I'm highly competitive. Sometimes it's a pain, but at other times, it works in my favor. She dug into the bowl of cereal they were having for breakfast. Do you want to rent a boat today? He asked. I thought we could get a speedboat and go out away, check out the marine life. Could be fun. Yeah, let's do it. Should we take a picnic? She'd always thought of picnics as being terribly romantic, but she'd never been on one with anyone she had feelings for. She liked the idea of doing it with him. He nodded. I'll get started on the picnic. You call the boat rental and see if they have any speedboats available today. After her phone call, she reported that there was one boat, and it was being reserved for them. I'm surprised there were so many taken in the fall like that. Me too. Maybe there's a boating convention. I don't think so. The island wasn't at all crowded, and it seemed to her it would be if there was a convention happening. Maybe their boats are being repaired because it's the off-season, he suggested. That makes a lot more sense to me, Bobbi agreed. She donned a big floppy hat she'd found earlier in the week and smiled at him. Now my face won't burn. She was already turning the color of a lobster. SPF 48 just couldn't do enough for her. You look glamorous, he said. I hope there's something to fasten it under your chin, so it won't blow away. She smiled, showing him 2 ribbons. It ties. I made sure it did, because I figured I'd wear it on a boating day. She never got to wear big floppy hats. She'd even considered gardening, just so she could feel normal wearing one. Of all the fun things they did while they were on their honeymoon, Bobbi would always remember that day as her favorite. They sped through the water and then just drifted while they ate their lunch. Thankfully, he was a good navigator, and they didn't find themselves lost at sea. I think I see some dolphins, she said, getting excited. We need to go somewhere you can swim with dolphins, he told her. Have you ever done that? She shook her head. Never. Have you? Yeah, I went on a cruise with a few buddies about 10 years ago. We stopped in Cozumel and swam with the dolphins. It was pretty amazing. I think I'd love that. She couldn't imagine having the opportunity to be so close to the majestic creatures. It sounded like a dream come true to her. The dolphin who was assigned to us had a new calf, and she kept swimming over to check on her baby. It was really cool. The trainer had to keep calling her back over. He said it was her first day back to work since the baby was born, and she was doing as well as they could expect. I think watching her with the baby made the whole experience a lot more fun for us all. There were so many things she realized she wanted to do. When she was at home in Logan, all she thought about was her job and how she could do it better and more efficiently. Now that she was away from work, she could see how deeply she'd thrown herself into it. Do you ever think you may work too much? She asked, just as they docked the boat. That's a pretty heavy thought for such a beautiful day. I guess I know I work too much, but it goes with owning and running a restaurant. I love what I do too much to even think about doing something else or working less. But when I'm away from home, somewhere like this, I realize that life keeps going as I bury myself in the job. That's kind of how I'm feeling. I think of all the couples that come and go from the hotel, and all the things they do. Some want to go rafting, and others want to climb rocks. All those things are in my backyard, and I never do them. That's just plain sad. She really needed to take a staycation and experience the wonders of living in such a beautiful place. It was hard to do anything but laundry on her days off. They were too few and far between. It is. We'll try to find things to do together once we get home. Do you worry we'll slip into our old routines and start ignoring each other? 'Cause I think that would be a real possibility. I do worry a little. I want my life to be filled with days like today, seeing dolphins in the ocean and picnicking in a boat, but my reality is that I make sure other people get their dream vacations, and I never think about taking one of my own. I get that. It gets harder every day, doesn't it? Knowing we only have a few days left. She nodded. I want to stay here forever. Gary smiled. You know as well as I do that you'd be bored to tears if you didn't work. I would too. We're just not meant to be running around playing all the time. Bobbi sighed. I know. It doesn't mean I don't wish I could be just a little more carefree. I do too. As they left the boat dock, he wrapped his arm around her and they walked together. If only the honeymoon could last forever. When it was time to head back to Utah, Bobbi packed up their little honeymoon getaway with tears in her eyes. She would miss their time there, but more than anything, she would miss being able to just spend time with her new husband and get to know him. She knew that as soon as they were home, they'd both dive back into work headfirst. In fact, she was a bit worried they'd never see one another with as much as both of them worked. When she'd finished packing, and he'd finished cleaning out the refrigerator, they met up in the living room. Time to go, Gary said softly. I know. I just don't think I'm quite ready yet. I'm not either. But we're both going to take Wednesdays off, and we'll have a day off together every week. We will still see each other. Well, I hope so, since we'll be sleeping together. Bobbi smiled. It just won't be the same as being here on the island. No, it won't, but it'll still be good. The two of them dragged their belongings out to the car. They'd taken the surfboards back the previous day. He ran the keys into the caretaker's office, and they started the drive back through Port Isabel to Brownsville. They were both silent as they crossed the bridge and headed to the airport. It felt like they were leaving something important behind, and the only thing Bobbi could think to call it was freedom. They were losing their freedom to enjoy one another, and they were getting back into the rat race. Hopefully, they would be able to find time for one another in their busy lives, but she wasn't sure it could happen. They stopped right before they got to the airport for an early lunch, and as they sat together, Bobbi almost felt as if it was their last meal together. She wasn't sure why she felt such a sense of impending doom, but she did. How could their marriage last if they never saw each other? And how could they ever see each other if they were both constantly working? They were back in Logan late on Saturday evening, 2 weeks after their wedding. As she moved her things into his bedroom, Bobbi said, I'm going to have to get the boxes I packed before the wedding tomorrow, which means you're going to have to see my parents again. Gary smiled. When was the last time your mother texted to ask if you were still alive? He knew the texts had been regular throughout the entire time they had been gone. There was a text waiting when we got off the plane in Salt Lake, she said. Mom is still being a pain about everything. I understand. He hit a yawn. It's late. I will help you move tomorrow, but I need to check in on the restaurant as well. Do you think your parents would be willing to meet us there for lunch? Do you really want them to? She asked, grinning at him. She couldn't imagine that he had any desire to get to know her parents better after the way her mother had been acting. Absolutely. I think they should see that I really am an upstanding businessman. They don't need to worry that you're going to die every minute of every day. She nodded. That's what we'll do then. She glanced at the time on her phone. It's only 8:30, but it feels like midnight. Different time zones, he said. And we got up early to get everything ready to come back. I'm just glad our trip home was so much more uneventful than the flight there. She nodded emphatically. I seriously thought we'd be stranded in Salt Lake forever. You're not the only one. Okay, I'm calling my mom to invite them to lunch tomorrow. I think it'll help. At least I hope it will. She tapped her mother's name on her phone screen and waited for her to answer. You're still alive. Mom practically yelled in her ear. Holding the phone at arm's length to avoid the loud noise, Bobbi said, I am. We're back in Logan. I wanted to know if you and Dad would meet Gary and me at his restaurant for lunch tomorrow. He needs to go in and make sure everything is still running smoothly, and it would be nice to see you and Dad. I'll be there some tomorrow anyway because I have to get all my boxes. We'd love to meet you for lunch. We went to the restaurant twice while you were gone, just to get an idea of what kind of man you married, and everyone sang his praises. I'm just surprised you didn't hire a private investigator, Bobbi said, rolling her eyes. I wanted to, but your dad told me it was an unnecessary expense, and I was being silly. Bobbi sighed. That is silly, you know. I know. I just worry about you. You're my baby, and it just doesn't seem right that you were the one who married a stranger. It should have been your sister Angela. She's the one who was always getting into trouble, and she can hold her own. You're my sweet one who never argues with anyone. Mom, sometimes I wonder whether you know me at all. Of course, I do. I changed your diapers after all. Why, I've seen your girly bits more often than that new husband of yours has. I guarantee it. I'm hanging up now, Mom. We'll see you at the restaurant at 1. Bobbi was so glad she hadn't had her mother on speakerphone. Gary did not need to hear her mother talk about her girly bits. Okay. Don't die before then. I won't die, Bobbi said, shaking her head. Be safe. I'm always safe. Bobbi ended the call and looked at Gary. She wanted to hire a private investigator, but Dad talked her down. He didn't think it was a necessary expense. Gary grinned. Just so you know, they wouldn't have found anything other than a traffic ticket. Good to hear. Mom is really in all-out crazy mode. I hope that you can make her feel better tomorrow. Gary smiled. Parents are my specialty. I'll handle them. I'm not looking forward to moving all those boxes tomorrow. Are there a lot? He asked, envisioning his house filled to the ceiling with boxes. Not more than 20 or 30, she said. But that seems like an awful lot to me. I can understand that. We'll handle whatever you have. I'm not terribly worried about it. Good. I also have lots of clothes we need to bring over. I hate moving clothes. I got one of those boxes with a closet rod, so it shouldn't be awful, but I just hate transferring everything. Bobbi dreaded the unpacking that would need to be done after everything was moved. She'd have to promise herself a box a day, or she might just hide the boxes from herself. Sounds like your room is all packed up though. You won't need to do any packing? She shook her head. I did it all. It's just a matter of grabbing all the boxes and moving them here. She yawned. I'm tired just thinking about it. I'm going to help, he said. Do you want me to see if there are any of the guys who work for me who are willing to help out? I can grease their palms a little. Order a pizza. Why would they want pizza when they can eat your food whenever they want? She asked. Because they're college students. College students thrive on pizza and being stupid. Good point. I remember when I was in college, and your description sums up the vast majority of people I knew. I was the boring one, though. I spent all my time studying. That's sad. You need to have some fun. She shrugged. I was more interested in working and finishing school quickly. Did you work for the hotel while you were in college? He asked. Yup. I started there right after high school. I was looking for any job I could get my hands on, and I saw an ad that they were hiring. I started out as the front desk clerk for the early morning shift. When I graduated, I was offered the job I have now. I couldn't ask for better employers. That's cool. I had at least 10 jobs while I was in culinary school. And really? Culinary school isn't nearly as long as a full college degree. I went on to apprentice, so I did spend a lot of time in school, but not as much as you did. She nodded. Sounds like it was a good time in your life. The best. Chapter 8. Bobbi's parents were right on time at the restaurant the following day, and though Bobbi was still exhausted, she was happy to see them. She hugged her mother. "I hope you're going to stop texting me to see if I'm alive every couple of hours now that we're back." She wasn't sure she could keep from losing her mind if her mother kept texting her the way she had. Her mother frowned. "He could still clobber you over the head and leave you at the bottom of a mountain for dead. Say you'd taken up rock climbing." "Ocean would have been easier, dear," Dad told her. "If he was going to do that, he'd have done it on their honeymoon." Gary sighed. "I told you I wouldn't hurt your daughter. All is well." He had no idea why these people were convinced he was psychotic. He'd never hurt anyone in his life. Convincing them he wasn't going to harm their daughter was his #1 goal in life. The hostess looked nervous having to seat Gary and his wife and in-laws, but she handled it, taking them to a table off in one corner so they could talk privately. "Is this table all right?" she asked. "It's great," Gary said. "Thanks, Miranda." He was pleased to see she was doing as she was instructed. Miranda smiled. "I'll get your server." "Thank you," Bobbi said. "Mom, the ground beef sour cream enchiladas are to die for. And you need to try the empanadas." She was excited for her mother to try the food there. Mom made a face. "You know I stick to tacos or fajitas at these places." She wasn't very adventurous where food was concerned, and she didn't like what she termed foreign foods. "Would you trust me?" Bobbi asked. "Just this once?" Mom nodded. "All right, if you think they're so wonderful, then that's what I'll have." Gary ordered a bowl of queso and the empanadas again while everyone else was trying to figure out what they wanted to eat. He'd already told Bobbi she needed to try something new and not eat the same things over and over. Bobbi perused the menu and decided on tostadas. She loved the flat tacos so much. For her they were just easier to eat. She knew she'd eventually make her way through the entire menu, but it was easier to start with things she knew she liked. While they waited for the food, George grilled Gary. "So why did you decide on Texas for your honeymoon?" Gary smiled. "I went to culinary school in Dallas, and I lived in Texas for a few years after, learning everything I could about Tex-Mex cuisine. While I was there, I went on vacation with a buddy to South Padre Island, and I loved it, so I thought it would be a wonderful place to take my new bride." Gary smiled at Bobbi, hoping seeing them together and getting along would help her parents decide he was good for her. "Did you like it?" Mom asked Bobbi. "Oh, yeah. It was wonderful. Gary taught me how to surf, and we played miniature golf. We swam most days, and one day we took a boat out and saw dolphins and had a picnic right there on the ocean." She wanted to tell her mother how wonderful it had been being alone with Gary for almost 2 whole weeks, but she was certain her mother didn't want to hear about that part of her marriage. "You could have died," Mom said. Bobbi sighed. "I've managed to make it for 28 years without dying." "You can't trust me to stay alive for 2 weeks?" Gary grinned. "Don't worry, Georgette. I took good care of her. She doesn't look abused. You should have had her wear a little more sunscreen though. Her sunburn looks like it has a sunburn." Mom frowned at Bobbi, obviously worried about the sheer amount of sun she'd gotten while away. Bobbi shook her head. "I slathered on sunscreen right before we went outside every single time. Bobbi's aunt had skin cancer a few years back, and her mother never let any of her daughters forget that it ran in the family." "You always say that," Mom said, looking skeptical. "I can vouch for her," Gary said. "I thought she was going to drown in the stuff." "Well, joking about drowning is not funny," Mom said. "Especially since you went on a honeymoon to the ocean, where drowning was a very real possibility." Dad frowned, looking at Mom. She was fine. He turned back to Gary. "Do you own this business outright, or is there a loan on it?" Bobbi's father was a banker, and he had strong opinions about what kinds of loans were good and what kinds were bad. He obviously wanted to make sure that his new son-in-law knew how to run a business properly. Gary didn't seem to mind. "I took a loan out when I first started it, but I had 3/4 of the capital saved. I've now paid off the loan, and my house will be paid off in 2 years. I'm very financially responsible. He hadn't been right after culinary school, but he'd learned by doing. And he hadn't wanted to be paying off his business every day for the rest of his life. That was more information than Bobbi had known about his financial situation, but she didn't tell her parents that. They were already more worried than any parents had the right to be. As her dad continued to grill Gary, her mother kept eyeing her, as if she was looking for signs of abuse. I'm happy, Mom. Really? Bobbi nodded. I worry a little that we won't have time for each other now that we're home, but I hope I'm wrong. We both just work a lot of hours. You know you don't have to work 6 days a week, right? Your employers would be quite happy with 5 days, and you could work shorter hours as well. Bobbi knew her mother thought she worked too much, but she had learned over the years that her mother always found something to complain about. I know, I just don't like to let anyone less experienced handle the concierge desk. I feel like I know the area better than the others, so I will do a better job as concierge. Though she was determined to train a new person so she could take time off when she was ready. You can't control everything, Mom said. Maybe it's time for you to think about your real future, the one you share with your husband and any children that may come along. Your job is just that. A job. You don't need to work yourself to death to be worth something. I never thought I did. I know we've pushed all you kids to go after your dreams, but we never expected any of you to take what we said quite so seriously. You work too hard, Bobbi. I'd love to see you slow down enough to smell the roses. You won't be able to work that many hours when you're pregnant, you know. And you're not getting any younger. The reminder that she was only a couple years shy of 30 annoyed Bobbi more than she dared express. Her mother loved her so much, but sometimes it felt like she was being smothered. Thankfully their appetizers arrived then, and Bobbi watched her mother try the empanadas for the first time. They're better with a little of the queso on them, Bobbi said. Oh, they're delicious. I should have gotten this as my meal. I'm certain I won't like the sour cream enchiladas the way you say I will. Bobbi decided not to argue anymore. You're right, Mom. Why bother? Well, you have to give me a chance with them. You can't just tell me I won't like them. I might. Bobbi couldn't help but laugh. Mom, you are a pain in my butt sometimes. That's not a nice way to talk to your mother, Bobbi Jean. Dad frowned at her. What are you thinking? Bobbi had been convinced that Dad and Gary had been so involved in their own conversation she could say anything without either of them even noticing. I'm just being silly, I guess. Gary smiled at her, squeezing her hand under the table. When the food appeared, Bobbi couldn't have been more relieved. Her mother liked the enchiladas. These are good, Bobbi. I have no idea why you told me that I wouldn't like them. You can be so persnickety at times. Bobbi shrugged. She felt like everything she said was going south quickly, and she just wasn't willing to play her mother's game any longer. The woman drove her to the brink of madness. Thankfully, her father and Gary seemed to be getting along well. Do you golf? Her dad asked. Gary shook his head. Not well, at least. Bobbi beat me up at miniature golf. He looked over at his wife and smiled. Well, of course she did. She went to college on a golf scholarship. George looked at Bobbi with pride. She could have gone pro, and I sometimes still wish she had. Gary's jaw dropped and he turned to look at Bobbi. You couldn't have told me that? No wonder she'd beaten him so soundly. She smiled sweetly. You didn't ask. Besides, she'd been angry with him that day. Why would she divulge information that would make him feel a little better about himself? George shook his head. She should have told you, but our Bobbi doesn't like to brag, unlike her sisters. She was the best golfer her high school had ever seen. Absolutely amazing. When she was little, she followed me around the golf course and always begged me to let her play. Once she started, she was hooked. Gary sighed. I guess maybe I need you to teach me play golf, he said to Bobbi. I haven't played in years. I mean, other than our mini golf game, which was a lot of fun, by the way. Bobbi knew she should feel a little guilty about not telling him that she'd been a college golfer sooner, but it didn't bother her at all. She didn't know everything about him, and he didn't know everything about her. "There's no one better to teach you," George said. She ended up teaching so many of her classmates in high school. The school was trying to put together a female golf team because there are always women's golf scholarships left on the table. I offered to volunteer as coach because I knew Bobbi would stand out, and she recruited her friends. It went well. Though the boys' coach was always trying to steal her from me. She told me all she did was study in school. George shrugged. Yes, she studied and golfed. She wasn't one to fool around. And she worked as much as she could as well. She really was a fighter back then. Still is, I think. As they left the restaurant, Bobbi smiled at Gary. "My dad really likes you. And you went to college on a golf scholarship." "You heard my dad. There are more scholarships for female golfers than there are female golfers. I was a shoo-in." Gary sighed. "You were really good, weren't you?" "My coach wanted me to go pro, but I just didn't have the desire. I had found a job I was happy with, and I knew I'd get a promotion after graduation. There was no reason for me to do something so risky." "Why would it be risky?" he asked. "There's always a risk of injury. I probably could have made it in the pro circuit for a year or two, but I didn't have any desire to go for any longer than that. And I loved my job enough that I didn't want to leave it simply so I could play a game for a living. What if the job was no longer there when I got back? No, I'm happy with my decisions." Gary nodded. "And it was definitely your decision. But I want you to teach me to play golf." Bobbi looked at him with wide eyes before getting into the passenger seat of his car. "Look around you. We can't even see the grass because there's so much snow. You do realize golf balls are white, don't you?" "Very funny." He got into his car and waited for her to give him directions to her parents' house. He peppered her with questions about her golf career as he followed her instructions. When he pulled up in front of her parents' house, he smiled. "I kind of imagined a house like this where you'd grown up." "Well, I'm at a disadvantage now. I want to see your parents' house." "Can you take a couple days off at Christmas?" he asked. "I'm not sure. I can try." Bobbi had never tried to get Christmas off. Instead, she'd accepted it as her duty to work the days no one else wanted. "Let's go see my parents then if you can get off work. It's a big travel time, so we'll have to stay with Mom and Dad, but they'll love it. Mom keeps telling me it's time for her to meet you." "You've talked to your mom about me?" "Just some texts. She's messaged almost every day asking more and more questions about you. I wish I could have told her what a good golfer you are, but you kind of hid that information from me." Bobbi shook her head. "Time to stop talking about my golfing." "It isn't a big deal now, but it was then," he asked. "It was my whole life for a while. I didn't feel like life was worth living if I didn't have a golf club in my hands. I spent every spare minute hitting balls around, and I even went to indoor putting practice in the winter. But that was a long time ago." He followed her into the house and her old bedroom. She pointed to a couple of boxes. "Those are books. I hope you don't mind lugging those." She picked up a lighter box. Putting a number that indicated how heavy each box was had made things a lot easier. Her father came in and looked around. "What's my highest number?" he asked. 3, Bobbi said. "I'm making Gary get all the 5s. He nodded. "Sounds good. We'll knock this out in no time." It took 3 trips in Gary's SUV, but Bobbi was completely moved in by that evening. Her parents helped load the car up, but they let Bobbi and Gary unload at the new house. When the last load was in the vehicle, Bobbi hugged her mother. "I wrote down my new address on your notepad in the kitchen. We're planning to be here for Thanksgiving, but we're going to try to go to his parents for Christmas." "But you can't," Mom said, frowning. "Why not? I've never not had you with me for Christmas. From the day you were born, you were always at my side. You loved to open your presents, so you wouldn't even leave the room until every single gift was open for fear one of your sisters would steal your gifts. Bobbi smiled. Now you have grandkids to come and open presents. Kids are more fun at Christmas time anyway. She knew her mother preferred all her children be there, but this year just wouldn't work. Gary's parents should get some time with them as well. Dad hugged Bobbi. We'll see you for whatever holidays you and Gary work out for us. Thanks, Dad. You like him, don't you? I really do. He's a good man. And his food is excellent. I think he's a keeper. I'm glad, Bobbi said. I think so too. She still worried about what would happen when they went back to work the following day, but they would handle things. They had to. When she got out to the car and got in, Gary looked over at her. Did you say your goodbyes? I did. You'd think I was moving to another country with the way my mother is acting. Dad likes you so all is good in his world. She shook her head. My mom thinks I need to be here for Christmas, but I told her we're going to your parents' house. It's not fair for her to get all the holidays, but she thinks she should. Your mother loves you. It's so obvious on her face. Bobbi leaned back. Not only was I the youngest in my family, but I was a preemie. I was born at 24 weeks gestation, and the doctors were sure I wouldn't survive. I was in the NICU at Children's Primary for a long time. When I finally got home, Mom didn't want me out of her sight. That makes sense. I sensed there was something more than a regular mother-daughter relationship there. There was and is. It's all right though. Mom was in rare form today. Usually, she's a lot lower key than she was. Gary changed lanes on the main street in Logan. Sometimes it felt as if every single car in town was on the same street all at once. I really liked your dad. Are we planning to be with them on Thanksgiving? He asked. She nodded. Yeah, I think Mom would lose her mind if I missed 2 holidays in a row. She's practically losing it anyway. He pulled into the driveway of their house. Let's get this unloaded. Do you go back to work tomorrow? He paused for a moment. I can't believe I didn't think to ask you that. I do. I'm excited to hear how everything went while I was away. Bobbi got out of the car and grabbed her first box. I'll unpack a couple of boxes every evening, but the only things I really need are clothes, and those will be put away tonight. Good. What do you want to do about supper? He asked. No idea. Why do we have to eat 3 times per day? It's a pain, isn't it? Gary took one of the heavier boxes to carry inside. Would you be all right if we just ordered a pizza tonight? I don't think I have the energy to do more than that. I don't blame you. Yeah, let's order a pizza. Tomorrow we both go back to work. She should be excited to go, but she dreaded it. She didn't want the honeymoon to be over. What time do you go in? He asked. I have to be there by 8. You? I need to show up when I show up. Usually, I'm there for at least an hour before we open at 11. If I plan breakfast for 7, will that give you enough time to eat and then get to work on time? It will. You don't have to cook for me though. Because you know where McDonald's is? Gary asked. I'm cooking. I don't trust their food at all. Whatever makes you happy, she said, and she found she meant it. She needed him to be happy, and she was pleased that he always seemed chipper. Well, unless they were talking about the way she liked her steak, he was happy. As they carried in the rest of the boxes and put them in the spare room where she'd slept her first night, she thought about how nice it was to have someone who cared about her. Maybe he wasn't in love with her yet, but she could feel their bond deepening every single day. Soon. There would be love soon. She was certain of it. Chapter 9. Within a week it felt as if everything had gone back to normal in Bobbi's life. She was working a ridiculous number of hours, including her usual day off, and once again living to work instead of working to live. Gary wasn't at all bothered because there was so much to do at the restaurant after being gone for 2 weeks. He had competent people working for him, but they never did things exactly the way he would do them, which was hard for him. They had even decided there were better places to keep things in the kitchen, and he hated change, especially in his primary workspace. It was Wednesday of the following week before the new couple really had any time together other than sleeping in the same bed and the activities that went with sleeping together. They'd even stopped having breakfast together after 2 days, and Bobbi was back to eating drive-through breakfast. On Wednesday morning, Gary looked at Bobbi. "What should we do today?" "Laundry," she suggested. He groaned. "Besides laundry, we need to do something together that involves neither of us working." "Want to drive down to Park City and go skiing?" She thought about the sheer amount of laundry that needed to be done. No time. Unfortunately, it was their leaning ladies' week off. "We could find a hill and sled?" "I love sledding. But again, the laundry needs to be taken care of. We must have 6 loads between us." Gary sighed. "We have to do something to commemorate our first day off together." He appreciated that she believed in working before she played, but this was taking it to the extreme. "Like what?" "We could have a laundry sorting party." "How about that?" He wasn't certain why, but he suddenly felt extremely rejected by his new wife. There's more to life than laundry. Why didn't she want to have fun with him? Was something wrong with him that he didn't know about? "That's true. Why don't we hurry through the laundry and then do something together this evening? Do you want to go see a movie?" That way she wouldn't feel guilty about all the laundry waiting while she was at the movie. "Work first and then play." He smiled and nodded. "I think that's a great idea. And I'll make us a special dinner for before the movie." "I'm in." "What are you making?" she asked. "I haven't decided yet. I probably have to hit the grocery store for whatever we need today as well, but that's easy if I have a date night to look forward to. We need to promise that we'll make sure we do date night every Wednesday for the rest of our lives. Perhaps a date night once per week would keep their marriage alive." She worried so much about them becoming casual roommates because of the sheer number of hours they both worked. He nodded. "I completely agree." "Well, not with the Wednesday part. We need to agree to a weekly date night." He walked over to her where she was standing in the kitchen, wrapping his arms around her. "I think we also need to agree to remember to touch at times when we're not in bed together." Bobbi sighed. "I don't think we've done that since we went back to work." "You're right though." She wrapped her arms around him as well and sank into the embrace. It felt so good to just touch him. "Maybe I should cut my hours. I could work 40-hour weeks and no one would even complain." She would have to train another person to help out, but it was time for her to do that anyway. "I'm not ready to do that yet," he said, frowning. "I need to hire a new manager and get him trained first. One of my assistant managers is moving with his wife to Vermont, where they're going to grow their own food and sell it. Something like that. I need to train his replacement, and then I'll cut my hours." "Sound good?" She nodded. "I'll work lots while you work lots, but when you cut your hours, I'll cut mine." Their day off together was perfect. He made steaks for supper with shrimp and mashed potatoes which he loaded as if they were baked. He even cooked her steak the way she preferred. The movie was good, but she was more interested in the man beside her. Bobbi knew she was falling for him. She just worried their marriage wouldn't be able to last with all the time they spent apart. There had to be a way for the two of them to find more time to be together. There just had to. By Wednesday of the next week, everything was back to their normal, working all the time and never seeing each other. Neither could take Wednesday off, and that became their norm. They spent Thanksgiving with her family, but as the meal was over, she went to the hotel, and he went to his restaurant. It was a week before Christmas when Bobbi realized she didn't feel like she knew enough about her husband to even buy him a gift. They had planned 2 days off for Christmas, and one would be spent driving to Jackson, and the other back. They'd have a few hours with his family, and that would be it. She knew she had to take advantage of their time on the trip to tell him that she loved him, but she didn't think their marriage could work. Not with the way it was going anyway. They had to stay together for a full year because they'd both signed a contract that they would, but as soon as the contract was up, they needed to go their separate ways. With as much as Gary worked, he needed a stay-at-home wife. That's all there was to it. And she was not meant to not work. It was her everything. Or it had been before she'd met Gary. She was happy and sad all at once as his wife. She felt that their relationship was slowly draining away while they both worked themselves into an early grave. 2 days before they were to leave for Christmas with his parents, Bobbi started throwing up. She hoped that whatever she had was over quickly so she didn't have to stay home for Christmas. She mentioned the vomiting to her friend Gloria while they both ate a quick lunch in Gloria's office. "I don't want to miss Christmas." Gloria raised an eyebrow. "When was your last period?" Bobbi had to stop and think about that, and her eyes widened. "You think I'm pregnant?" "I do. I'll cover the concierge desk for an hour. Go buy a test, and we'll know for sure one way or the other." Bobbi nodded. "I'm leaving this here, because if I look at it for another second, I will hurl." She indicated the rest of her Chick-fil-A sandwich on Gloria's desk. "Go get the test. Wouldn't it be great to tell Gary you're pregnant as a Christmas present?" Bobbi wasn't so certain, but she hurried off to buy the test anyway. Less than an hour later, Bobbi knew exactly what was wrong with her. She was definitely pregnant. She wasn't sure whether she should be jumping up and down excitedly or sobbing her eyes out. It wasn't working with Gary, even though she loved him, and she suspected he loved her as well. "You were right," she told Gloria. "I'm pregnant." "That's so exciting," Gloria said, hugging Bobbi. "I remember my first pregnancy. John was such a pain. If he started moving, I'd try to get Jerry to feel it, and he'd stop as soon as Jerry came close. It was so annoying." Bobbi smiled, still trying to figure out what to do and how to tell Gary that it wasn't working. Did she have to tell him? "My trick for pregnancy nausea is simple. I buy airsick bags, and I carry them in my purse. Now, I keep some around all the time. I know it's weird, but it really does work. You can throw up discreetly and throw the bag away at the end." "That's strange." "I know. But it works." Gloria eyed Bobbi. "You have dark circles under your eyes. Maybe you should go home early today. You have tomorrow and the next day off anyway. It's time you gave yourself a little attention." Bobbi wanted to say no, but she knew her friend was right. She had to take care of herself to have a healthy baby. "Are you sure?" "I'm positive." "Go." Bobbi gathered her things and headed home. Instead of going straight to work on her small mountain of laundry, she went into the bedroom and fell face first onto the bed, still fully clothed. More than anything in the world, she needed to sleep and sleep. When Gary pulled into the driveway late that afternoon, he frowned when he saw Bobbi's car. She had been planning to work late that day. He'd come home early himself to fix a nice supper. They'd be heading to Wyoming first thing in the morning, so it was just better if they had an early night of it. Walking into the house, he called her name, but he didn't see her. Maybe she'd gone shopping with her mother or something, and that's why her car was there. It was Christmas shopping time after all. He went straight to the kitchen with the groceries he'd stopped for on the way home and started to create a perfect meal. Hopefully when she got home from wherever she was, Bobbi would appreciate his efforts. He was planning to tell her he loved her that night, and he needed everything to be set up perfectly for it. It was after 8 when he started to worry, and he called her. He could hear her phone ringing, so he went through the house looking for her. She never left her phone behind. He found her sound asleep in bed and knew she must have been there for at least 5 hours, because that's how long he'd been home. He sat beside her and put a hand on her shoulder. "Bobbi? Are you okay?" Bobbi slowly opened her eyes. "Hello." It took her a minute to realize it was dark. "Wow. What time is it?" "I only meant to lie down for an hour." "It's after 8. What time did you lie down?" "About 1:30. She sat up in bed. "Sleeping tonight is going to be fun. Is everything all right?" "I'm worried about you." "You don't sleep in the middle of the day." Bobbi nodded. "Not usually, no. Everything is fine." Her hand went to her belly. I've been sick to my stomach for a couple of days, and Gloria told me to take a pregnancy test. We're going to be parents. She watched his face carefully as she gave her news. Seriously? Have you seen a doctor? She laughed softly. Not yet. I'll make an appointment after Christmas. He grabbed her and held her close. I want to go with you to the appointment. Really? She loved the idea of him being involved with her pregnancy, but they weren't even involved with each other's lives much, so she wasn't sure he'd care to be there. Really? I love you, Bobbi. And I already love the little one you're carrying. The words from him took her by surprise. How could he love her and never want to spend time with her? You do? He nodded. I came home early today so I could make a nice supper. I wanted to tell you I loved you over a nice meal. She smiled. And instead, I ruined your special moment by telling you I was pregnant. She was still certain it was time for them to call their marriage quits, but now that there was a baby on the way, that made things harder. Any ideas about names? He stood and took her hand, pulling her to her feet. Let's eat, and we can talk names while we enjoy supper. He was a bit let down that she hadn't told him she loved him as well, but he knew she had to be reeling from the news she'd gotten that day. While they ate, he talked about converting the spare room into a nursery. I think the room you slept in on our wedding night would be perfect for a nursery, don't you? She nodded, not sure what else to say. He was excited, and she was as well, but how were they going to be a family if they never saw one another? I want to decorate the room in Sesame Street. It was my favorite as a child, and I think all the characters would look good in a nursery. He shrugged. You can decorate it however you want. He frowned as something else occurred to him. You're going to have to work less hours if you're pregnant, won't you? She nodded. A little, I think. But Gloria is ready for me to cut my hours whenever I am. We've talked about it quite a bit. She has me training another person at work, so there will be 3 of us, and the concierge desk is only open until about 10. I'll be the manager of the other 2. That's a great idea. When will you start cutting your hours then? She shrugged. If I need as much sleep as I needed today, then I'll cut them right after we get back. I'm not sure though. She wanted to tell him how she was feeling about their marriage, but she wasn't certain how. It would probably be easier if she talked to him during the long drive the next day. I think you should, he said softly. You don't need to work as hard as you do, and it may be too hard on you with the baby coming. She nodded. Maybe. She didn't want to start spending a ton of time home alone though. Bobbi felt so emotional about the very idea. Do you want a boy or a girl first? He asked. Never really thought about it. I wasn't one of those girls who would lie awake in bed and dream of having babies. I was more focused on what I could do. Looking at him, she smiled. What about you? Boy or girl? I want a boy first. I want girls, but I think I'll need help protecting them from the men of the world. Makes sense. She took another small bite of her food, wondering how long it was going to take her stomach to feel better. I'm kind of feeling all-day sickness at the moment. I thought it was just supposed to be in the morning. I don't know if that's normal or not, he said, giving her a concerned look. I hope you get into the doctor right away. I'll try. After supper, she helped wash the dishes. She offered to do them herself, but Gary wouldn't hear of it. Nope. I'm doing them. You can help a little if you feel up to it. I'm expecting, not sick. They look the same from where I'm standing, he said. That night, he didn't try to make love with her and instead just held her in his arms as she drifted off to sleep. For him, sleep took a lot longer. He couldn't stop imagining his perfect future with her and their children. Lachele had done something right by matching the 2 of them. First thing the next morning, Bobbi packed for their trip while Gary cooked breakfast. As she packed, she thought about how much harder it would be to pack for a trip in a year. Now it was just her clothes and Gary's and their toiletries. It only took a few minutes. Next year, she'd be packing her clothes, Gary's clothes, and the baby's clothes. Then there would be toiletries, and then all the baby accoutrements. A playpen and diapers and baby wipes, and it was all too overwhelming for her to think about at the moment. Later. She'd think about it later. As soon as she finished packing, Gary carried their suitcase to the car. "I can carry it," she protested. "You can, but I don't think you should. I want you to see the doctor before you start trying to lift things that are heavy." She sighed. "You're going to be overprotective through my whole pregnancy, aren't you?" It made her feel good for a moment, but she was sure he was just worried about the child she carried. He had been clear with her about how much he wanted children. "Probably. It's who I am." "I see." And she did. But she didn't want to. "Do you want me to drive a bit?" "Nah. I enjoy driving. The roads are clear, so there's nothing to worry about. You just rest." "I've slept 15 out of the last 24 hours. I think I'm all rested out," she protested. "You're sleeping for 2 now." "That's not a thing." Bobbi stared out the window as they started through Logan Canyon. It was such a beautiful drive, but it was scary in the winter. The only real source of water for the animals was Bear River, which ran parallel to the road. The visibility was less than ideal, because of the twists and turns along the way. She'd always heard it wasn't about if you'd hit a deer in the canyon. It was about when you'd hit a deer. After a long stretch of silence, she asked, "Are you happy?" Gary was a bit startled by the question. "I'm right where I want to be in life. I'm married to someone I love, and we're expecting our first child. How could I be anything but happy?" "You don't wish we had more time together?" she asked. "Well, of course, I do, but I understand that in our stage of life, we both need to work hard to get where we want to be in our careers. In a few years, we'll be able to cut back and work less." He shrugged. "By then, I think I want another restaurant. Maybe in Garden City. It would only be open during the summer and on the weekends, but we'd make a killing all summer long." She was a bit annoyed at his subject change, but she was determined to have this discussion with him as they drove to his parents' house. Things needed to be said, and apparently she would need to be the one to say them. "I worry that we don't spend enough time together to keep our marriage going. We only did the date night thing 1 week before we were both too busy for that again." Bobbi hoped he'd understand where she was coming from. "You know I have to train Tad to get him up to speed before I can start really taking time off." "We're almost there. I have been letting him manage, but I'm there in case there's something that goes wrong." He rubbed her arm with his free hand. "It's all going to be a lot better soon." "I'm not so sure," she said softly. "We've talked about this over and over, and we were going to be able to see each other more soon, and we were going to have regular date nights. I don't think a marriage between 2 people who work as much as we do can really work." Gary was stunned. "Are you saying you want a divorce?" She took a deep breath, not wanting to say the words aloud, but they were the truth. "Yeah, I think after our obligatory year is up, we're going to need to separate. I can't imagine spending the rest of my life with a man who puts his work before me and our child." Chapter 10. The rest of the car ride passed in silence. Gary wasn't even sure what to say to Bobbi any longer. She seemed determined to end their marriage. It made him feel like a failure. He had no idea what he'd done wrong, but he was going to find out. He couldn't let her go that easily. When he pulled into his parents' driveway, he put his hand on her arm. "Let's not tell them about the baby, or the divorce. I need them to be happy at least for a little while." "Wouldn't them knowing about the baby make them happy?" she asked. His words made no sense to her at all. It would, but then they'd be devastated by the divorce. Not yet. He was determined to convince her that they were meant to be together anyway. He just had to figure out how to go about doing it. "I won't say anything," she told him, wishing she had a better idea how he was feeling about what she'd said. He hadn't argued with her, so perhaps he understood that she was right. She didn't know why she had hoped he'd try to get her to stay with him. He grabbed their suitcase and led her up the steps of an old wraparound porch that looked like something she would love to spend time on in the summers. She wished she knew they'd be there again, but it would be her last visit. Of that she was certain. Gary opened the door for her, and she stepped in first, feeling out of place. He obviously had no qualms. "Mom, Dad. We're here." An older woman hurried into the room. She was plump and covered in an apron. To Bobbi she looked like someone's mother, and she wanted to bury her face in the woman's shoulder and cry her heart out. Before she could say anything, Bobbi was swept up into an embrace. "It's so good to finally meet you. Gary has been talking about you for a couple of months now, and I know he's deeply in love." Bobbi smiled, but she felt horrible inside. How could his mother know how much he loved her, and talk to her about it, when she was standing there ready to divorce him? "It's good to meet you, Mrs. Grant." "Oh, call me Alice," she called over her shoulder. "Jacob, get in here and meet Gary's wife." A man came into the room. He was wearing overalls and a t-shirt. He looked like he'd just come in from milking the cows or some such thing. Bobbi had never been a country girl, so she really didn't know what he would have been doing. He grasped her hand. "Good to meet you, Bobbi." "It's nice to meet you as well." Bobbi felt like both were watching her intently, as if they expected her to break into song and dance, but she wasn't certain what to do. Gary broke the silence. "Mom." He walked into his mother's embrace and then shook hands firmly with his father. "Thanks for having us for Christmas." "No problem, but you're helping me with Christmas dinner tomorrow." "Both of you," she said, including Bobbi in her glance. "I don't cook," Bobbi said. "I can do things like cut up vegetables if you don't care if they look pretty. Other than that, I'm pretty darned useless in the kitchen." Mrs. Grant laughed. "Well, we'll find something for you to do. You won't get out of helping cook that easily." Bobbi smiled. "That sounds good." Gary picked up the suitcase. "I'm going to put our things in my old room, and then I'm taking Bobbi for a walk. She needs to see the waterfall." "It's cold out there, Mrs. Grant said. "Bundle up or you'll catch your death of cold." "You sound like my mother," Bobbi said softly. "Oh, I am your mother now. Don't you dare think otherwise." Bobbi's heart was immediately warmed by the sweet woman. "Thank you. That is very sweet." Gary was gone for much longer than she would have thought, but she made small talk with her new in-laws. When Gary came back, he took her hand in his and led her outside, walking toward the west with a purpose in his stride. When they were a couple of minutes from the house, he said, "We need to talk." Bobbi sighed. "I'm not sure how that's going to help anything. We've talked and made promises to each other that neither of us have kept. How will talking even more help? I want to know how you feel about me. Do you just hate me? Is that why you want a divorce?" A tear leaked from the corner of her eye. She hated that he thought she didn't love him. "No, I love you with everything inside me. But I can see myself becoming too dependent on our relationship, and you being too busy at work, and me being alone with the baby night after night. It just doesn't seem like the right time for us to be together." I called work while I was upstairs. Tad is going to start working on his own, and I'm cutting back to 40 hours a week. I'll take Wednesdays and Thursdays off, and we're going to spend as much time together as we can. "It's too late," she said softly. "We've made those promises to each other over and over. How can I trust that it will work? How can you give up on me so quickly? You say you love me, but you're willing to throw our marriage away like so much rubbish? It's not like you to just quit, Bobbi. No, it's really not." She looked down at her feet in the snow and sighed heavily. "I don't want to quit, but I'm afraid to become even more emotionally invested than I already am. What happens if I trust you to not break my heart, and when the baby comes along, you get too busy to spend time with us again? That's not going to happen. Sure, there will be periods where I'll be extra busy at work. When we're down a manager, for instance. But that will be the exception, not the norm. You have to trust me." She took a deep breath. "I want to stay with you. I'm scared of losing you while you're right there beside me. I can understand your fears, but if we both work to make sure it doesn't happen, then it won't." He reached the waterfall he'd wanted her to see, and he stood behind her with his arms around her middle staring at the water as it cascaded down. I've had my heart broken a couple of times. My answer is always to return to this exact spot and watch the water tumble over the rocks. You're the first person I've ever brought here though. I want you to feel the same healing I feel when I stand here. Maybe if we are here together it will heal us both. Bobbi turned in his arms. All right. I'm in it to win it. If you are certain you can change your ways, and I commit to changing mine, perhaps we'll be able to parent this child together. You mean it? He asked. She nodded. I'm in love with you. How could I do anything else? Gary leaned down and kissed her. We're doing it together, right? Absolutely. 8 months later, Bobbi walked the halls of the hospital with Gary at her side. This is supposed to speed up my labor, why isn't it happening? Bobbi asked, frustrated that their persnickety child wasn't coming out as planned. She's going to be here soon. We'll just keep walking. Going back into her labor room, she saw both her mother and her mother-in-law sitting together. Her mother was reading a book while his mother was crocheting a pink and purple afghan for the baby. How are you feeling? Georgette asked. Bobbi sighed. Like I'm going to look like a watermelon for the rest of my days. How are you? Her mother shook her head. You need to enjoy the entire pregnancy experience. I loved being pregnant. George stepped into the room in time to hear that. That's a load of hogwash. You hated every single pregnancy. I remember you telling me that if I got you pregnant one more time, you'd push me off a building. I never said that. Bobbi rolled her eyes. You two are a mess. But we're your mess, her mother responded. 12 hours later, after the nurses had cleaned the baby, Bobbi held her daughter for the first time. What are we going to name her? Gary asked for what seemed like the millionth time. They had talked about baby names more than anything else in the past 8 months, and they still hadn't chosen one. I still like Samantha, Bobbi said. And I did all the work. He groaned. Fine. We'll name her Samantha. She smiled, stroking the baby's cheek. She's perfect. She is. Gary looked at Bobbi. Are you feeling better about us? I am. I shouldn't have said everything I did at Christmas. I loved you so much, and it seemed like I loved you a little more every day. And, I never got to see you. I couldn't see how it was going to work out between us without seeing each other, and a child thrown into the mix felt like an explosive situation. But I did what I said. You did. You have been great. We've both cut back our hours. And we decorated the nursery together. That was really fun. Sure. Fun. He thought how different her idea of fun was than his. Thanks for giving me another chance to prove to you that I love you and I love the child we made together. Samantha and I are just happy that things worked out. How do you know she's happy? He asked, looking at the tiny child she held. I know all her thoughts. Mothers become psychic the instant their children are born and put into their arms. Gary laughed. Who told you that? Oh, I've been watching a million different shows about childbirth. I know everything there is to know now. Bobbi grinned at him. When do you think we can buy her a set of golf clubs? Are you planning to teach her to play? Well, of course. She comes from great golfing genes. She stroked the baby's hand. I know she'll outshine her mother in no time. I guess I know what my future holds. Golfing every weekend, even if the weekends are in the middle of the week, she said with a laugh. And they always are. He leaned down and pressed his lips to hers. Thank you for giving me a beautiful baby. She's absolutely perfect. She is. I would say it was my pleasure, but it was actually quite painful in the end. I love you more than I ever imagined I could. Bobbi smiled, sighing contentedly. And I love you more than you love me. Isn't that how life works? When are we going to make her a brother? Let me recover from this one first. Gary just smiled, looking down at his wife and child. Everything was perfect now. Absolutely perfect.